You only use 10% of your brain. Picture this. You're sitting in a coffee shop and someone casually drops this line. If you could just unlock the other 90% of your brain, you'd basically become superhuman. You'd have photographic memory, telepathic abilities, maybe even move objects with your mind. Sounds incredible, right? But before we dive deeper, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's amazing how we're all connected, each of us chasing that perfect night's sleep. If this resonates with you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel Restwise, and join the journey. Now, back to it. This idea of hidden mental power has been floating around for over a century, inspiring countless movies, self-help books, and late-night infomercials promising to unleash your hidden mental potential. Here's the thing that's going to completely shatter this fantasy. Neuroscientists have been studying the human brain for decades, using advanced imaging technology, and what they've discovered is absolutely mind-blowing in the opposite way. You're not using 10% of your brain. You're not even close to using just 10%. You're actually using virtually all of it, almost all the time, even when you're sleeping. Let me explain exactly how we know this, because the evidence is so overwhelming it's almost embarrassing that this myth still exists. When researchers use functional magnetic resonance imaging, they can literally watch your brain in action. They can see blood flow, oxygen consumption, and electrical activity happening across your entire brain. What they observe is that even during the most basic tasks, like reading this sentence or remembering what you had for breakfast, massive networks of brain regions light up simultaneously. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. When neurosurgeons perform brain surgery, they sometimes need to stimulate different areas of the brain with tiny electrical currents to map out important functions before removing tumors. Every single time they touch a probe to brain tissue, something happens. The patient might smell roses, see flashing lights, feel tingling in their fingers, or suddenly remember their childhood bedroom in vivid detail. There are no dead zones. There are no unused areas just sitting there waiting to be activated. Now I know what you're thinking. Maybe you've heard about people who had brain injuries and seemed fine, or you've read about individuals who had large portions of their brain removed and still functioned normally. Surely that proves most of the brain is unnecessary, right? This is where the myth gets really sneaky, because there's a grain of truth that gets twisted into complete nonsense. Yes, the brain has something called neuroplasticity, which is its incredible ability to reorganize and adapt when damaged. If you lose function in one area, other regions can sometimes compensate by taking over those responsibilities. It's like having a really good team, where if one player gets injured, the others can step up and cover their position. But here's the crucial part that myth believers always miss. The brain doesn't compensate by using previously inactive areas. It compensates by reorganizing areas that were already active, essentially asking them to multitask. Think about it this way. Your brain weighs about 3 pounds, which is roughly 2% of your total body weight, but it consumes approximately 20% of your daily energy. That's like having a small laptop that uses as much electricity as a full-sized refrigerator. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes absolutely no sense if 90% of your brain was just dead weight. Natural selection would have eliminated such a wasteful organ millions of years ago. The real kicker is where this myth actually came from And it's going to make you question how many other facts you've accepted without thinking. The 10% claim seems to have originated from a misquote of psychologist William James in the early 1900s. James suggested that people only achieve a fraction of their full potential, which is completely different from saying they only use a fraction of their brain. Somehow, over the decades, this philosophical observation about human achievement got twisted into a literal statement about brain anatomy. The myth persisted because it feeds into something deeply human, our desire to believe we're capable of more than we realize. It's incredibly appealing to think that incredible abilities are just locked away inside us, waiting to be unleashed with the right technique or supplement. Self-help gurus and movie producers love this idea because it sells hope and creates compelling stories. But here's what's actually amazing about your brain, and it's so much more incredible than any myth. Right now, as you process these words, your brain is performing billions of calculations per second. It's managing your heartbeat, breathing balance, and body temperature while simultaneously analyzing language, accessing memories, and predicting what comes next in this sentence. It's running complex pattern recognition software that makes the most advanced artificial intelligence look primitive. Every single neuron in your brain, all 86 billion of them, is connected to thousands of others, creating a network so complex that we're still discovering new things about how it works. You're not using 10% of some untapped potential. You're using 100% of the most sophisticated information processing system in the known universe. Humans have only 5 senses. Right now, as you're watching this, close your eyes for just a second. Now, without looking, tell me exactly where your hands are positioned. Can you feel the weight of your phone or the texture of your chair against your back? Open your eyes. How did you know all of that information without using sight, sound, smell, taste, or touch? What you just experienced is proof that everything you learned in elementary school about human senses was incomplete. The shocking reality is that humans don't have 5 senses. We have somewhere between 9 and 21 distinct sensory systems, depending on how scientists classify them. The traditional 5 senses model isn't just oversimplified. It's so outdated that it's basically scientific mythology. Yet somehow, this incorrect information keeps getting taught in schools, repeated in documentaries, and accepted as fact by millions of people who never question it. Let me blow your mind with what you're actually capable of sensing right now without even realizing it. That ability you just used to know where your hands were positioned. That's called proprioception, and it's your body's internal GPS system. Specialized receptors in your muscles, joints, and tendons are constantly sending your brain detailed reports about the position and movement of every part of your body. Without this sense, you wouldn't be able to walk, write, or even feed yourself without staring at your hands the entire time. But proprioception is just the beginning. You also have equilibrioception, which is your sense of balance and spatial orientation. This system, centered in your inner ear, tells you whether you're upright, tilting, spinning, or moving. It's why you can stand on one foot with your eyes closed, or why you get dizzy when you spin around. Damage this system, and even simple tasks like walking become nearly impossible. Then there's thermoception, your ability to sense temperature. This isn't just an extension of touch. It's a completely separate sensory system with its own specialized nerve endings. You have different receptors for heat and cold, and they can detect temperature changes as small as a fraction of a degree. This is why you can sense warmth from a fire before you actually touch it, or why stepping into an air-conditioned room gives you an immediate sensation that has nothing to do with your skin being physically touched. Here's where it gets really fascinating. You also have nociception, which is your pain-sensing system. Pain isn't just damaged touch, it's its own complex sensory network designed to protect you from harm. Your pain receptors can detect mechanical damage, extreme temperatures, and even chemical threats. What's incredible is that pain signals travel through different nerve pathways than touch signals, which is why certain medications can block pain while leaving your sense of touch completely intact. But wait, there's more. You have chronoception, your internal sense of time passing. Right now, without looking at a clock, you probably have a rough idea of how long you've been watching this video. Your brain has dedicated systems for tracking seconds, minutes, and longer periods. This temporal awareness is so fundamental that when it's disrupted by certain brain injuries or drugs, people lose their ability to function in the world. You also possess interoception, which is your awareness of internal bodily signals. This is how you know when you're hungry, thirsty, need to use the bathroom, or when your heart is beating fast. It's your body's internal monitoring system constantly updating your brain about your physiological state. Some researchers believe that people with better interoceptive awareness are more emotionally intelligent and make better decisions. The reason we got stuck with the five senses myth goes back to ancient Greece. Aristotle identified sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch as the primary senses, and for over 2,000 years, nobody really questioned this classification. It seemed logical because these are the senses we're most consciously aware of, and they correspond to obvious sensory organs like eyes, ears, and nose. But modern neuroscience has revealed that sensory experience is far more complex than Aristotle could have imagined. We now know that even the traditional five senses are much more sophisticated than we once thought. Your sense of taste, for example, actually relies heavily on smell, temperature, texture, and even sound. That's why food tastes bland when you have a stuffy nose, or why potato chips wouldn't be nearly as appealing without that satisfying crunch. What makes this even more remarkable is that all these sensory systems are working together constantly, creating your unified experience of reality. Your brain is performing incredibly complex integration, taking input from multiple sensory channels and weaving them into a single, coherent perception of the world around you. The implications of understanding our true sensory capabilities are profound. It changes how we think about human potential, how we design technology, and how we understand conditions like autism or sensory processing disorders. When we recognize that humans are actually sensory powerhouses with sophisticated detection systems we're barely conscious of, it opens up entirely new ways of thinking about perception, consciousness, and what it means to be human. Your body is constantly gathering far more information about your environment than you ever realized, processing it at lightning speed, and using it to keep you safe, oriented, and functioning in the world. Shaving makes hair grow back thicker. Your dad probably told you this. Your older brother definitely mentioned it. Maybe you've experienced it yourself. That moment when you first shaved your legs or face and swore the hair grew back darker, coarser, and more stubborn than before. You might have even delayed shaving because you were terrified of creating some kind of hair monster that would haunt you forever. Well, I'm about to tell you something that's going to make you question every piece of grooming advice you've ever received. Shaving does absolutely nothing to change how your hair grows. Nothing. The thickness, color, growth rate, and texture of your hair are completely unaffected by whether you shave it, trim it, or leave it alone for years. This belief is so widespread and so convincing that even people who should know better, including some medical professionals, still repeat it. But it's complete nonsense, and the science behind why we believe it is actually more fascinating than the myth itself. Here's what's really happening when you shave, and why your brain tricks you into thinking hair grows back thicker. When hair grows naturally from your follicle, it starts as a tiny, soft point that gradually thickens as it gets longer. The tip of natural hair is tapered and fine, almost like the point of a pencil. But when you shave, you're cutting that hair shaft with a sharp blade at its thickest point, creating a blunt, flat edge where the tapered tip used to be. When that hair grows back, it's pushing through your skin with this blunt edge, leading the way instead of a soft, tapered point. The result feels coarser and looks darker because you're seeing the full diameter of the hair shaft right from the moment it emerges. It's like the difference between poking someone with a needle versus poking them with the eraser end of a pencil. Same material, completely different sensation. But here's where your brain really starts playing tricks on you. Hair growth happens in cycles, and different hairs are at different stages of this cycle at any given time. When you shave for the first time, you're often doing it during or just after puberty, when your hormones are already changing your hair texture naturally. Testosterone, which increases during adolescence in both boys and girls, actually does make hair grow thicker and darker over time. So when teenagers shave and notice coarser hair growing back, they're seeing the effects of hormonal changes that were going to happen anyway, not the results of shaving. The timing creates a perfect storm of false correlation. You shave, hormones kick in, hair gets thicker, and your brain connects the dots in completely the wrong order. It's like thinking that carrying an umbrella causes rain, because every time you bring one, it starts pouring. Now let's talk about what actually determines your hair characteristics, because this is where the real science gets interesting. Every hair on your body grows from a follicle, which is essentially a tiny factory deep in your skin. This follicle contains all the genetic instructions for that hair's thickness, color, and growth pattern. These instructions are written in your DNA and can't be changed by anything happening at the surface level. The follicle produces a protein called keratin, which forms the actual hair shaft. The thickness of this shaft is determined by the size of the follicle, which is genetically predetermined. It's like having a pasta machine set to a specific thickness setting. No matter how many times you cut the pasta that comes out, the machine will keep producing pasta of exactly the same thickness. Hair color works the same way. Cells called melanocytes in your follicle produce pigment that gets incorporated into the hair shaft as it grows. The amount and type of pigment is genetically controlled and has nothing to do with what happens to the hair after it leaves the follicle. Cutting hair can't send signals back down to the root to produce more pigment any more than cutting grass can tell the roots to grow greener. What makes this myth so persistent is that it feels logical. We see cause and effect relationships everywhere in life, and our brains are wired to look for patterns even when they don't exist. When something happens after something else, we naturally assume the first thing caused the second thing. Add in the fact that most people start shaving during puberty when their hair is naturally changing anyway, and you've got a perfect recipe for a widespread misconception. The myth is also reinforced by the shaving industry itself, though probably not intentionally. Razor commercials and grooming advice often mention managing thick, coarse hair, which implies that shaving creates these problems. But they're really just acknowledging that some people naturally have thicker, coarser hair that requires better tools to manage effectively. Understanding the truth about shaving can actually be liberating. It means you can make grooming decisions based on your preferences, not on fear of creating some kind of hair catastrophe. Whether you shave daily, weekly, or never, your hair will do exactly what your genetics programmed it to do, regardless of your choices. Lightning never strikes the same place twice. The Empire State Building gets hit by lightning about 25 times every single year. Some years it gets struck over 100 times. There's literally footage of the same skyscraper being hit by multiple lightning bolts in the same storm, sometimes within seconds of each other. Yet somehow, we still walk around repeating this phrase about lightning never striking twice, using it as some kind of wisdom about probability and second chances in life. Here's what's going to completely destroy your understanding of how lightning actually works. Not only does lightning frequently strike the same place twice, it actively seeks out the same locations over and over again. Lightning is basically the ultimate creature of habit, and once it finds a spot it likes, it keeps coming back like it's got a season pass. The reason this myth is so ridiculous becomes obvious the moment you understand what lightning is actually doing. Lightning isn't some random cosmic force throwing bolts around like dice. It's electricity taking the path of least resistance from the clouds to the ground, and that path is determined by very specific, predictable factors. Height, conductivity, isolation, and ground conditions all play a role in making certain locations lightning magnets. Think about it this way. If you're a bolt of electricity looking for the fastest route to the ground, are you going to pick a different path every time, or are you going to take the same convenient highway that worked perfectly last time? Lightning follows the exact same logic. If a location has the right combination of elevation, conductivity, and positioning, it's going to get hit repeatedly because those conditions don't just disappear after the first strike. The Empire State Building isn't an anomaly, it's exactly what we should expect. Tall buildings, cell towers, trees on hilltops, and radio antennas get struck constantly because they're the most attractive targets in their area. Lightning rods exist specifically because we know lightning will hit the same spots over and over. The entire concept of lightning protection is based on the fact that we can predict where lightning wants to go and give it a safe path to get there. But here's where this gets really fascinating, and it's going to change how you think about probability forever. The myth persists because we fundamentally misunderstand what randomness actually means. When people say lightning never strikes twice, they're treating each lightning strike like a coin flip, as if the universe keeps track of where lightning has been and tries to spread it around fairly. That's not how physics works at all. Imagine you're throwing basketballs at a gym full of hoops. But some hoops are 10 feet tall and others are 50 feet tall. You're not going to hit each hoop equally just because probability says so. You're going to hit the tall hoops way more often because they're easier targets. Lightning works exactly the same way. The tallest, most conductive, most isolated object in an area is like that 50-foot hoop. It's going to get hit repeatedly, not despite the laws of probability, but because of them. The real kicker is that we have mountains of data proving this myth wrong, and have had it for decades. Park rangers track lightning strikes on mountain peaks, and the same peaks get hammered year after year. Golfers know to avoid certain trees on courses, because those specific trees get struck regularly. Ships know which parts of the ocean see more lightning activity and plan their routes accordingly. Roy Sullivan, a park ranger in Virginia, was struck by lightning 7 different times throughout his career. 7 times. This guy was like a walking lightning magnet, and statisticians have calculated that the odds of this happening to a random person are about 1 in 10 to the power of 25. But Sullivan wasn't a random person in a random location. He worked outdoors in an area with frequent thunderstorms, often in elevated, exposed positions. Given his circumstances, multiple lightning strikes weren't freakishly unlikely, they were almost inevitable. The myth probably started as a way to comfort people who had experienced something terrible and unlikely. If your house got struck by lightning, someone might tell you not to worry because it'll never happen again. It's a well-meaning attempt to provide reassurance, but it's based on completely backwards logic. What's actually true is the opposite of comforting. If your house got struck by lightning once, it might very well have characteristics that make it more likely to get struck again. Maybe it's the tallest structure in the area, or it's positioned on high ground, or it has some conductive feature that attracts electrical discharge. Lightning doesn't care about fairness or taking turns. Understanding this truth is actually more valuable than believing the myth, because it can save your life. If you're ever in a situation where lightning is striking near you, don't think you're safe just because it hit something nearby. That nearby strike might actually indicate that you're in a high-risk area where lightning is attracted. The smart move is to get to proper shelter immediately, not to stand around assuming you've used up your bad luck quota for the day. Goldfish have a 3-second memory. Watch what happens when a goldfish owner approaches their tank at feeding time. The fish immediately swim to the front, clustering near the spot where food usually appears. They've learned to associate human footsteps, shadows, and specific times of day with meals. Some goldfish even learn to perform tricks, swimming through hoops or following their owner's finger around the glass. Yet we've somehow convinced ourselves that these same creatures forget everything that just happened 3 seconds ago. This is about to completely flip everything you think you know about fish intelligence. Goldfish don't have 3-second memories. They don't have 30-second memories. Scientific studies have proven that goldfish can remember things for months, recognize human faces, learn complex routines, and even tell time. The 3-second memory myth isn't just wrong. It's so spectacularly wrong that it's actually insulting to goldfish. Let me tell you about some experiments that will blow your mind. Researchers at Plymouth University trained goldfish to navigate mazes, and these fish remembered the correct path for weeks after learning it. Other studies showed goldfish could be trained to respond to different colors, sounds, and even music. They learned to swim through obstacle courses, push balls into goals, and perform sequences of behaviors in specific orders. One particularly impressive study found that goldfish could distinguish between different pieces of classical music and would swim in different patterns, depending on whether they heard Bach or Stravinsky. But here's where it gets really incredible. Goldfish have been observed exhibiting social learning, which means they can watch other goldfish perform tasks and then copy those behaviors. They form social hierarchies, recognize individual fish in their group, and even show signs of depression when isolated from companions. These are not the behaviors of creatures with 3-second attention spans. The memory capabilities of goldfish are so sophisticated that they can be trained to associate feeding times with specific locations in their tank. Some goldfish learn that food appears in the morning near the filter, at noon by the castle decoration, and in the evening near the plants. They'll actually position themselves in the correct location based on the time of day, which requires them to maintain multiple time-based memories simultaneously. Israeli researchers discovered that goldfish can remember feeding schedules for at least 3 months. They trained fish to expect food at specific times and found that even after months without reinforcement, the goldfish would still gather at the feeding spot at the appointed time. 3 months might not sound impressive to you, but for a creature we've been told forgets everything in 3 seconds, it's absolutely remarkable. Now you're probably wondering how this ridiculous myth got started, and the answer is going to make you question a lot of other things you learned as a kid. The 3-second memory claim appears to have been invented by pet store owners and parents who wanted to justify keeping goldfish in tiny bowls. If goldfish really forgot everything in 3 seconds, then keeping them in a cramped, boring environment wouldn't be cruel, because they'd never remember being uncomfortable. It's a perfect example of how we create myths to justify behaviors we know are probably wrong. The tiny fishbowl industry needed customers to believe that goldfish were basically swimming vegetables with no real consciousness or memory. The 3-second myth provided the perfect psychological cover for treating these animals poorly. The truth is that goldfish are actually quite intelligent as far as fish go. Their brains contain all the basic structures necessary for learning and memory formation. They have neurons that fire in patterns. They form synaptic connections that strengthen with repetition, and they show measurable brain activity that corresponds to different types of learning. In proper environments, goldfish can live for decades and continue learning new behaviors throughout their lives. What makes this myth particularly frustrating is that anyone who has actually observed goldfish for more than a few minutes can see evidence of their memory and intelligence. They learn to recognize their owners, anticipate feeding times, explore their environment systematically, and even play with objects in their tank. The evidence is right there, but we've been so conditioned to believe the 3-second myth that we dismiss what we're seeing with our own eyes. Understanding the truth about goldfish memory has real implications for how we treat these animals. If goldfish can remember for months, feel boredom, and experience social connections, then keeping them in tiny bowls becomes a clear case of animal cruelty. It means they deserve environments that challenge their intelligence, provide social interaction, and offer enough space to explore and establish territories. The goldfish memory myth is a perfect example of how fake facts can persist for generations simply because they serve someone's interests. Once you start questioning this kind of convenient misinformation, you begin to wonder what other animal intelligence myths we've accepted without evidence, and what that says about how we justify our treatment of the creatures we share this planet with. Vikings wore horned helmets. Every Halloween, kids dress up as Vikings with plastic horned helmets. Every movie about Norse warriors shows them charging into battle with magnificent curved horns jutting from their heads. Sports teams, metal bands, and tourist shops in Scandinavia all use the horned helmet as the universal symbol of Viking culture. There's just one tiny problem with this iconic image that's been burned into our collective consciousness for over a century. Real Vikings never wore horned helmets. Not once. Not ever. In fact, archaeologists have found exactly one complete Viking helmet in all their decades of excavation, and it's a simple, practical iron cap with no horns whatsoever. The horned helmet is pure fantasy, and the story of how this fake image became more famous than the actual history is absolutely wild. Here's what's going to shock you about actual Viking warfare. Those horns that look so intimidating in movies would have been a death sentence in real combat. Imagine you're in the middle of a sword fight and your opponent swings at your head. With a normal helmet, the blade might glance off to the side. But with horns sticking out, that sword is going to catch on the horn and transfer all its force directly into your neck. You'd basically be wearing a built-in handle for your enemies to grab, twist, and break your spine. Professional warriors don't wear accessories that help their opponents kill them. Vikings were incredibly practical people who spent their lives perfecting the art of staying alive in brutal combat situations. Their real helmets were designed by people who understood that every ounce of weight, every protruding edge, and every design choice could mean the difference between life and death. The single authentic Viking helmet we've found, discovered in Norway and dating to the 10th century, is a masterpiece of functional design. It's made of iron plates riveted together, with a nose guard to protect the face and a design that deflects blows rather than catching them. It's exactly what you'd expect from a culture that valued survival over style, and it looks nothing like the horned monstrosities we see in popular culture. But here's where this gets really fascinating, because the horned helmet myth didn't come from some ancient misunderstanding or archaeological mistake. It was invented in the 1800s by German opera designers who needed Vikings to look more dramatic on stage. When Richard Wagner was creating his famous Ring Cycle operas, his costume designers decided that regular helmets weren't theatrical enough for the mythical Norse gods and heroes in the story. So they added horns. Big, curved, impressive horns that would be visible from the back row of the opera house. The design was so visually striking that it immediately became the standard way to depict Vikings in art, literature, and eventually movies. Within a few decades, this completely fictional costume choice had replaced actual Viking imagery in the popular imagination. The irony is absolutely incredible. Wagner's operas weren't even about historical Vikings. They were based on Germanic and Norse mythology, featuring gods and supernatural beings who never existed in the first place. But somehow, the costume choices made for these mythical characters got transferred onto real historical people. And we've been perpetuating this mistake for over 150 years. What makes this even more ridiculous is that we actually know quite a bit about what Vikings really looked like. They left behind detailed descriptions in their sagas. We have archaeological evidence from their settlements, and contemporary accounts from people who encountered them. None of these sources mention horned helmets. In fact, most Vikings probably didn't wear helmets at all during raids, because they were expensive, heavy, and not always practical for the quick hit and run tactics Vikings preferred. The real Vikings were far more interesting than the horned helmet stereotype suggests. They were explorers who reached North America 500 years before Columbus, traders who established routes from Greenland to Constantinople, and innovators who developed some of the most advanced shipbuilding techniques of their time. They had complex legal systems, rich oral traditions, and surprisingly sophisticated hygiene practices. But none of that fits the barbaric image that horned helmets help perpetuate. This myth reveals something important about how historical myths are created and spread. It wasn't ancient people who got this wrong. It was modern people in the 1800s who prioritized dramatic effect over historical accuracy. The horned helmet became popular because it looked cool, not because it was true. And once it entered popular culture, it became almost impossible to correct. Understanding the truth about Viking helmets is like pulling back the curtain on how much of our historical knowledge is actually just recycled entertainment. It makes you wonder what other iconic historical images are completely made up, and how many other times we've let theatrical costume choices override actual evidence about how people lived and fought in the past. The Great Wall of China is visible from space. When the first Chinese astronaut, Yang Liwei, returned from space in 2003, reporters immediately asked him the question everyone wanted answered. Could he see the Great Wall of China from orbit? His response shocked an entire nation that had grown up believing their greatest architectural achievement was visible from space. He couldn't see it at all. Not even a hint of it. In fact, he spent extra time specifically looking for the wall because he knew people would ask, and he saw absolutely nothing. This moment should have ended one of the most persistent myths in human history, but somehow we're still teaching kids in school that the Great Wall is the only human-made structure visible from space. The reality is so much more complicated and fascinating than the myth, and it's going to completely change how you think about both space observation and the power of repeated lies. Let me explain exactly what astronauts can and cannot see from different altitudes, because the science behind this is mind-blowing. From the International Space Station, which orbits about 250 miles above Earth, astronauts can see highways, airports, large buildings, and even some bridges. But the Great Wall? It's practically invisible because it's narrow, made of materials that blend into the surrounding landscape, and often covered by vegetation or erosion after centuries of neglect. Here's the kicker that's going to make you question everything you've been told about the wall's visibility. The Great Wall is only about 20 feet wide on average. From space, that's like trying to spot a piece of string from the top of a skyscraper. Meanwhile, highway systems, which are much wider and made of reflective asphalt, are clearly visible from orbit. So if we're talking about human-made structures you can see from space, interstate highways should be way more famous than the Great Wall. But the myth gets even more ridiculous when you dig into the details. The claim isn't just that trained astronauts with telescopes can spot the wall under perfect conditions. The popular version of the myth claims you can see it with the naked eye from the moon. The moon is 239,000 miles away from Earth. At that distance, the entire Earth appears smaller than a marble held at arm's length. You literally cannot see individual continents clearly, let alone a narrow wall running across one of them. To put this in perspective, if the Great Wall were actually visible from the moon with the naked eye, then a human hair would be visible from over 2 miles away. That's not how vision works. That's not how physics works. That's not how anything works. So where did this completely impossible claim come from? The myth appears to have started in the early 1900s, decades before anyone had actually been to space to check. It was repeated in textbooks, encyclopedias, and travel guides as a way to emphasize the wall's impressive scale. The claim sounded plausible because the wall is indeed very long, stretching over 13,000 miles if you count all its branches and reconstructed sections. But length and visibility are completely different things. A fishing line can be incredibly long, but that doesn't make it easy to see from a distance. The Great Wall's most impressive feature, its enormous length, is actually what makes it hard to spot from space, because it's spread out over such a vast area with relatively little width. The myth persisted because it served everyone's interests. Chinese tourism officials loved having a claim that made their attraction sound uniquely spectacular. Textbook publishers kept repeating it because it was a memorable fact that made geography lessons more interesting. Space agencies didn't bother correcting it because they had bigger concerns than debunking tourist myths. What makes this especially frustrating is that we've had definitive proof the myth was false for over 20 years now. Multiple astronauts from different countries have confirmed they cannot see the Great Wall without telescopic assistance. Satellite images clearly show why it's nearly impossible to spot. Yet the myth continues to appear in educational materials, tourist brochures, and casual conversation. The real tragedy is that the Great Wall is genuinely one of humanity's most impressive achievements without needing fake claims about space visibility. It represents over 2,000 years of construction, involving millions of workers across multiple dynasties. The engineering challenges overcome during its construction were absolutely staggering. The cultural and historical significance of the wall is profound and fascinating. But somehow we decided that wasn't impressive enough, so we invented a completely false fact to make it sound more amazing. It's like claiming the Mona Lisa is beautiful because it changes colors in moonlight. The painting doesn't need fake magical properties to be remarkable, and neither does the Great Wall. Understanding the truth about the Great Wall's visibility reveals something important about how myths spread in the modern world. Sometimes the most persistent false facts are the ones that sound like they should be true, even when they're physically impossible. We swallow 8 spiders a year in our sleep. Take a second to think about the last time you woke up with something in your mouth. Maybe a strand of hair, a piece of lint, or just that gross morning taste. Now imagine waking up and realizing you'd unconsciously swallowed a live spider during the night. Most people find this idea absolutely horrifying, which is probably why the claim that we swallow 8 spiders per year in our sleep has become one of the most repeated gross out facts on the internet. Here's something that's going to completely flip your understanding of this supposed statistic. We don't swallow 8 spiders a year in our sleep. We don't swallow 1 spider a year. The average person swallows 0 spiders per year while sleeping, and this entire claim is not just wrong. It's so backwards that it actually demonstrates the opposite of what really happens between humans and spiders at night. Let me explain why this myth is ridiculous from a spider's perspective. Because once you understand how spiders actually behave, the whole idea falls apart instantly. Spiders are predators that rely entirely on stealth and surprise to catch their prey. They're extremely sensitive to vibrations, air currents, and movement. A sleeping human is basically a giant, warm, breathing, snoring earthquake from a spider's point of view. Your breath alone creates air currents that spiders can detect from several inches away. Every time you exhale, you're creating a hurricane, force wind tunnel that would send any spider scrambling in the opposite direction. Add in the vibrations from your heartbeat, the movement of your chest rising and falling, and the occasional snore or sleep movement, and you become the least appealing destination in any spider's neighborhood. But here's where the spider behavior gets really interesting, and it completely destroys the swallowing myth. Spiders don't wander aimlessly around at night looking for random places to explore. They're either sitting in their webs, waiting for prey to get trapped, or they're actively hunting in areas where they know food is likely to appear. Your mouth offers them absolutely nothing they want. There's no prey in there, no suitable web, building material, and definitely no reason for them to risk getting close to a massive, unpredictable giant. Even if a spider were somehow suicidal enough to approach your face, your mouth is not an attractive cave to explore. It's warm, humid, and filled with moving parts. When you sleep, your mouth produces less saliva, but it's still a wet environment that most spiders would find completely unsuitable. Spiders prefer dry, stable locations where they can set up ambush points or build webs undisturbed. Now let's talk about what would actually happen in the extremely unlikely event that a spider did somehow end up near your mouth while you were sleeping. First, you'd probably wake up. Spiders have tiny legs, but they're not weightless. The sensation of something crawling on your face would likely trigger your body's natural protective responses even during sleep. Second, if you did start to unconsciously swallow something unusual, your gag reflex would probably kick in and wake you up immediately. The origin of this myth is actually more interesting than the myth itself, and it's going to make you question how much other internet folklore you've accepted without thinking. The 8 spiders statistic was apparently created in the 1990s by a columnist named Lisa Holst, who was writing about how easily false information spreads online. She made up the spider swallowing claim as an example of the kind of absurd fact that people would believe and share without checking. The irony is absolutely perfect. Holst invented a fake statistic to demonstrate how readily people believe fake statistics, and her fake statistic became one of the most widely believed fake statistics on the internet. She proved her own point in the most spectacular way possible, creating a piece of misinformation that's still being repeated decades later. What makes this even more fascinating is that the myth has become so embedded in popular culture that people have started developing genuine phobias about it. Some individuals now sleep with their mouths taped shut or covered, creating actual health risks to avoid a completely imaginary problem. We've created real anxiety about a fake danger that was invented to show how easily fake dangers spread. The spider swallowing myth is actually a perfect case study in how our brains process gross out information. We're naturally drawn to disgusting facts because they trigger strong emotional responses, and strong emotional responses make information more memorable and shareable. The myth combines several elements that our brains find compelling. It's disgusting. It's specific enough to sound scientific, and it's about something that supposedly happens to everyone. Understanding the truth about spiders and sleep can actually help you appreciate these creatures more. Spiders aren't trying to crawl into your mouth or invade your personal space. They're just trying to catch flies and mosquitoes, which means they're actually providing a valuable service by controlling the bugs that really do want to bother you at night. Cracking knuckles causes arthritis. A Dr. Donald Unger had a problem. His mother, like countless other mothers throughout history, constantly warned him that cracking his knuckles would give him arthritis. So this scientist decided to conduct the most dedication-driven experiment in medical history. For 60 years, he cracked the knuckles on his left hand twice daily, while leaving his right hand completely uncracked. 6 decades later, he examined both hands for signs of arthritis and published his findings in a medical journal. The results are going to destroy everything your parents told you about knuckle cracking. Dr. Unger found zero difference in arthritis development between his cracked and uncracked hands. None. After 60 years of deliberate knuckle abuse on one side and careful protection on the other, both hands were equally healthy. His experiment was so thorough and his results so clear that he won an Ig Nobel Prize for his contribution to medical knowledge. But Dr. Unger's personal experiment isn't the only evidence that destroys this myth. Multiple large-scale studies involving thousands of people have found no connection between knuckle cracking and arthritis. Researchers have compared habitual knuckle crackers with people who never crack their joints, and the arthritis rates are essentially identical. If knuckle cracking caused arthritis, we'd see clear statistical differences between these groups, but we don't. Here's what's actually happening when you crack your knuckles, and it's going to change how you think about that satisfying pop sound forever. Your joints are filled with a lubricating fluid called synovial fluid that contains dissolved gases, primarily nitrogen. When you pull or bend your fingers in certain ways, you create negative pressure in the joint space, causing those dissolved gases to rapidly form bubbles. The popping sound is those gas bubbles collapsing back into the fluid, not your bones grinding against each other or your cartilage being damaged. It's essentially the same process as opening a champagne bottle or popping bubble wrap, just happening inside your joints. The sound might seem violent, but it's actually just gas moving around in liquid, which is completely harmless to your joint structures. Your bones, cartilage, and ligaments remain completely unaffected by this process. The reason you can't immediately crack the same knuckle again isn't because you've damaged something that needs time to heal. It's because those gases need time to redissolve back into the synovial fluid before they can form bubbles again. This refractory period typically lasts about 15 to 30 minutes, which is why chronic knuckle crackers develop a rotation system, moving from finger to satisfy their habit. Now you're probably wondering why this myth is so persistent if the science is so clear. The answer reveals something fascinating about how medical folklore spreads and persists across generations. The knuckle cracking warning appears to have originated from observations of people with arthritis who also happened to crack their knuckles. Early observers noticed the correlation and assumed causation without considering that both behaviors might be related to joint stiffness rather than one causing the other. People with naturally stiff or uncomfortable joints are more likely to crack them for temporary relief, and they're also more likely to develop arthritis due to underlying joint issues. It's like noticing that people who use canes often have trouble walking and concluding that canes cause mobility problems. The correlation exists, but the causation is backwards. The myth gained incredible staying power because it gave parents a concrete, scary consequence to use when trying to stop an annoying habit. Knuckle cracking can be disruptive in quiet environments, and the sound genuinely bothers some people. Rather than saying, "Please stop that because it's annoying," parents could invoke the specter of future arthritis as a medical reason to quit. What makes this particularly interesting is that knuckle cracking might actually have some benefits that nobody talks about. Many people report that cracking their joints provides temporary relief from stiffness and increases their range of motion. Physical therapists and chiropractors use similar joint manipulation techniques as part of legitimate medical treatments. The difference is that medical professionals know exactly how to apply these techniques safely and effectively. Some studies have even suggested that people who crack their knuckles regularly maintain better grip strength and joint flexibility as they age, though researchers are careful to note that this could be correlation rather than causation. It's possible that people with naturally more flexible joints are both more likely to crack their knuckles and more likely to maintain joint health over time. The truth about knuckle cracking is actually liberating for millions of people who've been living with guilt about their habit. You don't need to worry about giving yourself arthritis, but you also don't need to crack your joints compulsively if it bothers people around you or makes you feel self-conscious. Understanding this myth reveals how often medical folklore gets passed down through generations without scientific scrutiny, and how powerful parental warnings can become accepted medical facts even when they're completely wrong. Bulls hate the color red. Picture a matador stepping into the ring, dramatically swirling his bright red cape, as an enormous bull paws the ground and snorts with fury. The crowd holds its breath as the enraged animal focuses all its attention on that vibrant red fabric, preparing to charge with murderous intent. This scene has played out in countless movies, cartoons, and cultural references, cementing the idea that bulls have some kind of violent hatred for the color red. There's just one small problem with this iconic image. Bulls are colorblind to red. Completely, totally colorblind. They literally cannot see the difference between a red cape and a green one, or a blue one, or any other color you want to wave in front of them. What we've accepted as common knowledge about bull behavior is actually based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how these animals see the world. Here's what's going to blow your mind about bull vision. Bulls are dichromats, which means they have only 2 types of color receptors in their eyes, compared to the 3 that most humans have. They can see blues and yellows reasonably well, but reds, oranges, and greens all appear as varying shades of yellow or brown to them. From a bull's perspective, a matador's red cape looks roughly the same color as dried grass or hay. So, if bulls can't even see red as a distinct color, why do they charge at matadors with such apparent fury? The answer reveals something fascinating about animal behavior and human assumptions. Bulls aren't reacting to the color of the cape at all. They're responding to the movement, the waving motion, and the threatening posture of the human holding it. Think about how bulls behave in nature. They're prey animals despite their size and strength, which means they're naturally alert to sudden movements and potential threats. When something moves quickly and unpredictably near them, their instinct is either to flee or to neutralize the threat by charging at it. A matador waving a cape creates exactly the kind of rapid, erratic movement that triggers this defensive response. But here's where the bullfighting industry gets even more interesting, and it's going to change how you think about this entire spectacle. Matadors don't actually prefer red capes because they think it makes bulls angrier. The red color is purely for the human audience. Red shows up dramatically against the sandy arena floor, creates visual contrast that spectators can see clearly from the stands, and hides bloodstains that might accumulate during the fight. The traditional red cape, called a muleta, is essentially a theatrical prop designed to enhance the visual drama for paying customers. If bulls could see colors the way humans do, and actually had a preference for attacking red objects, matadors would probably choose a different color to avoid unnecessarily provoking their opponents. Professional bullfighters have known for centuries that color doesn't matter to bulls. They've experimented with different colored capes and consistently found that bulls react identically to movement regardless of the fabric's color. Some matadors have even used white, yellow, or blue capes during training sessions, and the bull's behavior remained exactly the same. The myth about bulls hating red probably started as a misinterpretation of what people observed in bullfighting arenas. Spectators saw bulls charging aggressively at red capes and naturally assumed the color was causing the aggression. It seemed like a logical connection, especially since red is associated with anger, danger, and violence in many human cultures. This assumption got reinforced by cartoons, movies, and popular culture, which found the red equals rage formula too entertaining to question. Bugs Bunny dodging charging bulls, cartoon characters using red objects to distract angry cattle, and comedy sketches about the dangers of wearing red around farm animals all helped cement this myth in the popular imagination. What makes this myth particularly ironic is that it reveals how much we project human color associations onto animals. We associate red with anger, passion, and aggression, so we assumed bulls must have the same emotional response to the color. But animals don't share our cultural color symbolism, and many of them don't even see colors the way we do. Understanding the truth about bulls and color vision actually makes their behavior more impressive, not less. These animals are responding to subtle cues about movement, body language, and spatial relationships that require sophisticated visual processing. They're reading the intentions and movements of their opponents with remarkable precision, using skills that have nothing to do with color discrimination. The bull and red cape myth is a perfect example of how entertainment industry needs can create lasting misconceptions about animal behavior. Once an image becomes iconic enough, it stops mattering whether it's scientifically accurate, and the myth becomes more powerful than the reality it supposedly represents. Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. Every school kid can tell you that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth at 29,030, 2 feet above sea level. It's the ultimate climbing challenge, the roof of the world, the mountain that defines what we mean when we talk about extreme altitude. Hundreds of climbers risk their lives every year trying to reach its summit, and reaching the top of Everest is considered one of humanity's greatest physical achievements. But here's something that's going to completely shatter this fundamental geographic fact. Mount Everest isn't the tallest mountain on Earth. It's not even close. There's a mountain that's almost 4,000 feet taller than Everest, and most people have never even heard its name. The only reason Everest gets to claim the title is because we've been measuring mountains wrong this entire time. Here's what's going to blow your mind about how we actually measure mountain height. When we say Everest is 29,000 feet tall, we're measuring from sea level to its peak. But sea level is completely arbitrary when you're talking about a mountain that's hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. It's like measuring the height of a skyscraper by starting from the basement of a building 3 blocks away. The real tallest mountain on Earth is Mauna Kea in Hawaii, and when you measure it properly from its actual base to its summit, it's 33,476 feet tall. That makes it almost 4,000 feet taller than Everest. The reason nobody talks about Mauna Kea as the world's tallest mountain is because most of it is hidden underwater. Mauna Kea rises from the floor of the Pacific Ocean, which means its base is about 19,000 feet below sea level. Only about 13,000 feet of this massive mountain is visible above water, which is why it doesn't look impressive when you see it from the surface. But if you could drain all the water from the Pacific Ocean, Mauna Kea would tower over Everest like a skyscraper next to a ranch house. Think about how ridiculous our current measurement system really is. We're essentially saying that a mountain doesn't count if it happens to have water around its base instead of land. It's like claiming that the Statue of Liberty isn't tall because part of it is standing on an island, or that underwater skyscrapers wouldn't count in a contest for the world's tallest building. But the measurement confusion gets even weirder when you consider what tallest actually means. If you want to talk about the point on Earth that's farthest from the center of the planet, that's not Mount Everest either. That title goes to Mount Chimborazo in Ecuador, which is about 6,700 feet farther from Earth's center than Everest's peak. This happens because Earth isn't a perfect sphere. It's slightly flattened at the poles and bulges out at the equator due to the planet's rotation. Mount Chimborazo sits almost directly on the equator, where Earth's diameter is at its maximum, while Everest is much farther north. So even though Chimborazo is only 20,500 feet above sea level, it's actually sticking out farther into space than Everest. The reason we've stuck with sea level as our measurement standard is partly historical and partly practical. Early mountain surveyors needed a consistent reference point that they could use anywhere in the world, and sea level seemed like the most logical choice. They couldn't exactly measure every mountain from its underwater base, especially with 19th century technology. But there's also a cultural reason why we've never corrected this measurement system. Mount Everest has become such an iconic symbol of human achievement and natural grandeur that changing the definition of tallest mountain would feel like cheating. People have died trying to climb what they believed was the world's tallest peak. Expeditions have spent millions of dollars and decades of planning based on Everest's reputation as the ultimate mountaineering challenge. The Everest climbing industry, which generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually, has no incentive to promote the idea that their mountain isn't actually the tallest. Tourism boards, documentary filmmakers, and adventure companies all benefit from maintaining Everest's status as the roof of the world. What makes this even more interesting is that our measurement confusion reflects a broader problem with how we think about natural records and geographic superlatives. We want clear, simple answers to questions like what's the tallest mountain? But nature doesn't organize itself according to human categories and measurement systems. Understanding the truth about mountain heights reveals how much our perception of natural wonders is shaped by arbitrary measurement choices and cultural mythology. Everest remains an incredible achievement to climb and a genuinely impressive mountain, but it's not the tallest mountain on Earth by any logical measurement standard. Einstein failed math as a student. If you've ever struggled with math class, you've probably heard the ultimate consolation story. Albert Einstein, the greatest scientific genius in history, supposedly failed math as a student. Teachers have repeated this tale to comfort frustrated kids for decades. Parents use it to reassure children that bad grades don't determine future success. The story has become so widespread that it's practically gospel among anyone who's ever felt intimidated by equations or calculus. The problem is that this comforting story is complete fiction. Einstein never failed math. In fact, he was a mathematical prodigy who mastered calculus by age 15, years before most students even encounter it. By the time he was 12, he had taught himself algebra and geometry. He was solving complex mathematical problems that would challenge college students while his peers were still learning basic arithmetic. Here's what's going to shock you about Einstein's actual academic record. He consistently scored the highest possible marks in mathematics and physics throughout his education. In the Swiss grading system, 6 was the highest grade possible, and Einstein regularly earned 6s in mathematical subjects. When he took the entrance exam for the Swiss Federal Polytechnic at age 16, he aced the math and science portions so completely that they admitted him despite his struggles with language and humanities subjects. The real story of Einstein's academic challenges is actually much more interesting than the failure myth, and it reveals something fascinating about how genius actually works in the real world. Einstein didn't fail because he was bad at math. He clashed with rigid educational systems because he was too advanced for them and questioned everything his teachers took for granted. Einstein's problems in school came from his personality, not his mathematical ability. He hated rote memorization, despised authoritarian teaching methods, and refused to accept answers without understanding the underlying principles. In German schools of the 1890s, this made him a problem student. Teachers wanted obedience and repetition, while Einstein wanted to understand why mathematical rules worked the way they did. When Einstein was 16, he did fail an entrance exam, but it wasn't because of math. He failed the general entrance exam for the Swiss Federal Polytechnic because it was given in French, which he barely spoke, and included subjects like literature, politics, and biology that he had never studied. The math sections of that same exam, he scored perfectly on every single one. So where did this persistent myth about Einstein failing math come from? The answer is going to make you question how many other inspirational stories are actually backwards. The myth appears to have started when someone misunderstood the Swiss grading system. In Switzerland, 6 is the highest grade and 1 is the lowest. In many other countries, including Germany where Einstein was born, the grading systems are reversed. When Einstein's old report cards surfaced, showing grades of 6 in mathematics, people who didn't understand the Swiss system assumed he had failed with the lowest possible score. The truth was exactly the opposite. Those 6s represented perfect performance, not failure. But by the time anyone bothered to check the actual grading system, the failure story had already spread around the world. The myth gained incredible staying power because it serves a psychological need that has nothing to do with Einstein's actual life. People want to believe that genius can emerge from failure, that bad grades don't matter, and that traditional education can't measure true intelligence. The Einstein failure story provided the perfect example of all these comforting ideas. Even though it was completely false, what makes this myth particularly harmful is that it fundamentally misrepresents how mathematical genius actually develops. Einstein didn't overcome early mathematical failure through persistence and hard work. He succeeded because he had extraordinary natural ability that he developed through intense curiosity and self-directed learning. He was reading advanced physics texts and solving calculus problems while other kids his age were playing with toys. The real Einstein story is actually more inspiring than the myth, but in a different way. Einstein shows us what happens when natural talent meets insatiable curiosity and the courage to question established ideas. He didn't need to overcome mathematical incompetence. He needed to overcome educational systems that couldn't handle his advanced thinking and social expectations that demanded conformity over creativity. Einstein himself was reportedly annoyed by the failure myth when it started circulating during his lifetime. When a magazine article claimed he had failed math, he responded by saying that before he was 15, he had mastered differential and integral calculus. He knew the myth was ridiculous because he remembered being far ahead of his classmates in mathematical subjects from a very early age. Understanding the truth about Einstein's education reveals something important about how we create legends around historical figures. Sometimes the stories we tell about genius say more about what we want to believe than about what actually happened. The tongue has taste zones. Remember that colorful diagram from elementary school science class. The one showing your tongue divided into neat sections like a map, with sweet tastes detected at the tip, sour on the sides, bitter at the back, and salty scattered around the edges. Teachers used this tongue map to explain how taste works, and you might have even done experiments where you placed different substances on specific parts of your tongue to test the theory. This diagram has appeared in textbooks, classroom posters, and science museums for over a century. The entire tongue map is complete nonsense. Every single taste bud on your tongue can detect every basic taste. There are no specialized zones, no taste neighborhoods, and no regions that only respond to specific flavors. Your tongue doesn't work like a restaurant with different sections for different types of food. It works like a massive, integrated tasting system where every part can sense everything. Here's what's going to blow your mind about how taste actually works. You have about 10,000 taste buds spread across your tongue, and each individual taste bud contains 50 to 100 specialized receptor cells. These receptor cells can detect sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, which is that savory taste you get from things like mushrooms, cheese, and soy sauce. Every single taste bud, whether it's at the tip of your tongue or way in the back, has receptors for all 5 basic tastes. When you eat something, molecules from your food dissolve in your saliva and bind to these receptor cells throughout your entire tongue simultaneously. Your brain then processes signals from thousands of taste buds working together to create your perception of flavor. It's like having a massive orchestra where every musician can play every note, rather than having a string section that only plays high notes and a brass section that only plays low notes. You can actually prove this to yourself right now with a simple test that will destroy any lingering belief in taste zones. Put a tiny bit of sugar on the back of your tongue, where the map claims you can only taste bitter flavors. You'll taste sweetness immediately. Try salt on the tip of your tongue, where supposedly only sweet receptors exist. You'll taste the saltiness perfectly. Every part of your tongue responds to every basic taste because that's how the biology actually works. The tongue map myth is so persistent that even many adults who should know better still believe it. Medical students sometimes encounter this misinformation in outdated textbooks. Restaurant servers occasionally use taste zone logic when describing how to properly taste wine or food. The myth has become so embedded in popular culture that correcting it feels almost impossible. So where did this completely wrong diagram come from? And why has it survived for so long? The story behind the tongue map is actually a perfect example of how scientific mistakes can snowball into educational mythology. In 1901, a German scientist named David Honig conducted experiments measuring taste sensitivity across different areas of the tongue. He found very slight variations in sensitivity, noting that some areas might be marginally more responsive to certain tastes than others. But here's the crucial part that got lost in translation. Literally, Honig never claimed that different areas could only taste specific flavors. He found minor differences in sensitivity, not exclusive zones. When his research was translated into English and simplified for educational purposes, these subtle sensitivity variations got transformed into rigid taste territories that didn't exist in the original findings. The tongue map gained traction because it seemed logical and was easy to teach. Teachers loved having a simple diagram that made taste seem organized and predictable. Students found it easier to memorize distinct zones rather than understanding the complex reality of how thousands of taste buds work together. Textbook publishers kept reproducing the map because it was visually appealing and fit neatly into lesson plans about the five senses. What makes this myth particularly frustrating is that the real science of taste is actually much more fascinating than the fake zones. Your sense of taste works closely with your sense of smell to create the complex experience we call flavor. About 80% of what we think of as taste is actually smell. When you have a stuffy nose, food tastes bland not because your taste buds stopped working, but because the aroma molecules can't reach your olfactory receptors. Your taste system is also incredibly sophisticated at detecting potentially dangerous substances. Bitter taste receptors are especially sensitive because many toxic compounds taste bitter. Sweet receptors help you identify energy, rich foods. Sour receptors can alert you to spoiled or fermented foods. This system works because every part of your tongue can detect every type of taste, providing maximum protection and information about everything you put in your mouth. Understanding the truth about taste zones reveals something important about how educational myths persist, even when they're scientifically ridiculous. Sometimes the simplified version becomes more powerful than the complex reality. And once a myth gets embedded in textbooks and classroom materials, it can survive for generations despite being completely wrong. Bananas grow on trees. Walk through any grocery store, and you'll see bananas hanging in perfect yellow bunches, looking exactly like fruit that dropped from a tropical tree. We talk about banana trees in casual conversation, use phrases like money doesn't grow on trees while pointing to bananas as obvious examples of tree fruit, and countless children's books show monkeys swinging from banana tree branches. The mental image is so deeply embedded in our culture that questioning it seems absurd. Here's something that's going to completely upend your understanding of one of the world's most common fruits. Bananas don't grow on trees. They never have. What we call banana trees aren't trees at all. They're actually the world's largest herbs, and the structure that looks like a trunk is really just a collection of tightly wrapped leaves, forming what botanists call a pseudostem. This revelation is going to make you look at banana plants completely differently. That massive, tree-like structure that can grow 20 feet tall and looks substantial enough to climb. It's essentially a giant herb with no actual wood inside it. If you cut through what appears to be the trunk of a banana tree, you won't find rings of wood growth like you would in an oak or maple. Instead, you'll discover layers of soft, fibrous leaf material wrapped around each other like a massive green onion. The technical classification gets even more mind-bending when you understand what bananas actually are botanically. They're berries. Not just any berries, but specifically they're classified as leathery berries, which puts them in the same category as grapes and tomatoes, rather than tree fruits like apples or oranges. So bananas are berries that grow on herbs, not fruits that grow on trees. Here's where banana biology gets really fascinating and completely destroys our tree-based assumptions. The actual banana plant lives underground as something called a rhizome, which is essentially an underground stem system. What we see above ground is just the flowering and fruiting part of this underground plant. Each pseudostem produces one bunch of bananas and then dies, while the underground rhizome sends up new pseudostems to continue the cycle. This means that banana plantations aren't actually forests of individual trees. They're massive networks of connected underground plants, sending up temporary above-ground structures to produce fruit. It's like having a single enormous plant with multiple periscopes poking up through the surface, each one producing bananas before disappearing and being replaced by new periscopes. The reason we've been calling them banana trees for so long comes down to a simple case of visual assumption. They look like trees, they're tall like trees, and they produce fruit like trees, so our brains automatically categorized them as trees. Early European explorers who encountered banana plants in tropical regions had no reason to examine the internal structure of these massive plants. They looked tree-like enough to earn the tree designation, and that classification stuck. But here's what makes this misclassification particularly interesting from a botanical perspective. True trees have something called secondary growth, which is what creates the wooden trunk and the rings you see when a tree is cut down. Banana plants only have primary growth, which means they get taller but don't develop woody tissue. They're essentially massive versions of the herbs growing in your garden, just scaled up to incredible proportions. The herb classification also explains some banana plant behaviors that seem weird if you think of them as trees. Real trees can live for decades or centuries, growing stronger and producing more fruit over time. But banana pseudostems die after producing fruit, which makes perfect sense when you understand they're just temporary flowering stalks sent up by an underground herb system. This underground network system is actually why banana cultivation is so efficient. Farmers don't need to plant new banana trees because the underground rhizome system continuously produces new pseudostems. A single banana plant can keep producing new fruiting stalks for decades, which is why banana plantations can maintain production without constant replanting. Understanding the truth about banana plants reveals something fascinating about how we classify the natural world based on appearances rather than actual biology. We created the category of banana tree because it fit our visual expectations, not because it matched botanical reality. The herb versus tree distinction also has practical implications that most people never consider. Because banana plants don't have woody trunks, they're much more vulnerable to wind damage than actual trees. This is why banana plantations in hurricane-prone areas often suffer devastating losses, and why banana cultivation requires different agricultural techniques than tree fruit farming. What makes this botanical revelation particularly striking is that it forces us to reconsider our assumptions about plant classification and growth patterns. The natural world doesn't always organize itself according to our visual categories, and sometimes the most obvious classifications are completely wrong when you examine the underlying biology. body heat escapes mostly through your head. Your mother probably told you this 1,000 times. Put on a hat or you'll catch cold because you lose most of your body heat through your head. Coaches yell it at athletes during winter practices. Survival guides repeat it as essential knowledge for staying warm in emergencies. The idea that we lose 50, 60, or even 80% of our body heat through our heads has become such accepted wisdom that questioning it feels like arguing with basic physics. This widely believed fact is completely wrong. Your head loses heat at roughly the same rate as any other part of your body when adjusted for surface area. The only reason your head might seem like a major source of heat loss is because it's often the only part of your body that's uncovered when you're dressed for cold weather. Here's what's going to destroy everything you think you know about body heat distribution. When researchers actually measured heat loss from different parts of the human body using thermal imaging and precise temperature sensors, they found that your head accounts for about 7 to 10% of total heat loss. That's almost exactly what you'd expect based on the fact that your head represents about 7% of your total body surface area. Your head isn't some magical heat radiating furnace that behaves differently from the rest of your body. It's just skin and tissue like everywhere else, following the same basic principles of heat transfer that govern your arms, legs, and torso. Heat moves from warm areas to cold areas, and the rate of heat loss depends on surface area, temperature difference, and insulation, not on which body part we're talking about. Think about this logically for a second. If your head really lost heat much faster than other body parts, wouldn't evolution have given us thicker skulls, more hair, or some other adaptation to prevent this massive energy waste? Instead, humans actually have relatively little hair on their heads compared to other mammals, which suggests our heads aren't the thermal liability this myth makes them out to be. The confusion about head heat loss comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of how clothing affects our perception of temperature. When you're dressed warmly with a coat, gloves, thick pants, and insulated boots, your head might be the only significant area of exposed skin. In that situation, yes, your uncovered head will be responsible for a disproportionate amount of heat loss, but that's not because heads are special heat radiators. It's because everything else is insulated. It's like saying that windows lose more heat than walls while ignoring the fact that walls are insulated and windows aren't. The difference isn't in the fundamental heat transfer properties of the materials. It's in the insulation surrounding them. Cover your head with a hat and expose your arm instead, and suddenly your arm becomes the major source of heat loss. The myth appears to have originated from military studies conducted in the 1950s, where researchers measured heat loss in subjects who were fully clothed except for their heads. Naturally, they found that the uncovered heads were responsible for a large percentage of total heat loss. But when those same researchers conducted follow-up studies with subjects who had uncovered heads and uncovered limbs, the heat loss percentages evened out dramatically. Unfortunately, the initial findings about head heat loss got separated from the context that explained them. The fact that subjects were fully clothed, except for their heads, got lost, and the conclusion that heads lose lots of heat became accepted as a general principle, rather than a specific finding about insulated versus uninsulated body parts. What makes this myth particularly persistent is that it contains just enough truth to feel believable. Your head does lose heat when it's uncovered, and covering it does help you stay warmer. The myth isn't wrong about the practical advice. It's wrong about the underlying explanation. Wearing a hat helps you stay warm, not because your head is a special heat loss zone, but because covering any significant area of exposed skin helps retain body heat. The survival implications of this myth are actually more interesting than the myth itself. In genuine cold weather emergencies, keeping your extremities covered is crucial for preventing frostbite and hypothermia. But focusing obsessively on your head while ignoring exposed hands, feet, or other body parts could actually be dangerous. Heat loss is about total exposed surface area, not about which specific body parts are uncovered. Understanding the truth about body heat distribution can actually make you better at staying warm, because it helps you make smarter decisions about layering and insulation. Instead of obsessing over hat wearing, you can focus on minimizing total exposed skin area and ensuring that all parts of your body have appropriate insulation for the conditions. The head heat loss myth is a perfect example of how practical advice can survive even when the scientific explanation behind it is completely wrong. Sometimes the right behavior gets supported by the wrong reasoning, and the behavior becomes so associated with the false explanation that correcting the science feels like attacking common sense. Humans evolved from chimps. Picture the classic evolution poster hanging in every biology classroom. You know the one. It shows a chimp gradually transforming through a series of increasingly upright figures, until it becomes a modern human walking confidently into the future. This linear progression from ape to human has become the universal symbol of evolution, appearing on T-shirts, museum displays, and countless educational materials. It's so embedded in popular culture that most people just assume it's an accurate representation of how human evolution actually worked. That famous evolution poster is completely misleading. Humans didn't evolve from chimpanzees. We didn't evolve from any modern ape species that exists today. What actually happened is that humans and chimps both evolved from a common ancestor that lived about 6 to 7 million years ago. We're cousins, not descendants and ancestors. Here's what's going to completely change how you understand human evolution. When that common ancestor species existed millions of years ago, it eventually split into different populations that evolved in separate directions. One evolutionary branch led to modern chimpanzees and bonobos. Another branch led to humans. Both species have been evolving and changing for the same amount of time since that split occurred. This means that modern chimpanzees are just as evolved as modern humans. They're not primitive versions of us that got stuck in an earlier stage of development. They're the result of millions of years of evolution, optimizing for their specific environment and lifestyle, just like we are. Saying humans evolved from chimps is like saying you evolved from your cousin. You both came from the same grandparents, but neither of you is the ancestor of the other. The family tree analogy makes this crystal clear. Imagine your family tree going back several generations. You and your cousin both descend from the same great-great-grandmother. But you didn't evolve from your cousin, and your cousin didn't evolve from you. You're both modern endpoints of separate family lines that branched off from a common starting point. Human and chimp evolution works exactly the same way, just on a much longer timescale. What makes this misconception even more interesting is that it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about how evolution actually works. Evolution isn't a ladder with species climbing up toward some predetermined goal of becoming more human-like. It's more like a branching tree, with different species adapting to different environments and ecological niches over time. The common ancestor we shared with chimps was neither fully human nor fully chimp. It was its own distinct species with characteristics that gave rise to both lineages. When populations of this ancestor species became separated, perhaps by geographic barriers or environmental changes, they began evolving in different directions based on the specific challenges and opportunities they faced. The human lineage developed traits like bipedalism, larger brains, and complex tool use because these adaptations were advantageous for our ancestors' particular lifestyle and environment. Meanwhile, the chimp lineage developed their own specialized adaptations like incredible upper body strength, knuckle, walking, and sophisticated social behaviors that helped them thrive in forest environments. Both evolutionary paths were equally successful in their own contexts. There's no objective measure by which humans are more evolved than chimps or vice versa. We're both highly specialized products of millions of years of natural selection, just optimized for different ways of life. The linear evolution poster became popular because it tells a compelling story about human progress and makes evolution seem simple and directional. It feeds into our desire to see ourselves as the inevitable endpoint of evolutionary development, the culmination of life's journey toward intelligence and consciousness. But this narrative completely misrepresents how evolution actually works. Real evolutionary trees look nothing like that famous poster. They're incredibly complex, branching diagrams showing hundreds of extinct human ancestor and relative species, multiple dead ends, and parallel developments. The actual story of human evolution involves dozens of different hominin species that evolved, thrived, and went extinct over millions of years. Many of these extinct species were our direct ancestors, while others were evolutionary cousins that developed alongside our lineage before eventually dying out. Some of them had fascinating combinations of traits, like small brains, but advanced tool use, or ape-like bodies, but human-like teeth. The diversity of extinct human relatives is absolutely mind-blowing and shows just how messy and non-linear our evolutionary history really was. Understanding the truth about human evolution changes how we think about our relationship with other species. We're not the pinnacle of evolution that other animals are trying to become. We're one branch on an enormous tree of life, sharing common ancestry with every other living thing on Earth, but each species following its own unique evolutionary path. This perspective is actually more amazing than the linear progression myth, because it reveals the incredible creativity and diversity of evolutionary processes, and it connects us to the rest of life in ways that the latter model never could. Water conducts electricity. Every disaster movie has that terrifying scene. Someone drops a toaster into a bathtub, or a power line falls into a puddle, and everyone within 20 feet gets electrocuted instantly. We've been taught from childhood never to touch electrical appliances with wet hands, never to use electronics near water, and that mixing water with electricity is an absolute recipe for death. This fear is so deeply ingrained that most people won't even change a light bulb if their hands are slightly damp. Here's something that's going to completely flip your understanding of one of the most basic safety rules you've ever learned. Pure water doesn't conduct electricity at all. It's actually an excellent electrical insulator. So good that electrical engineers use distilled water to clean sensitive electronic components without worrying about causing short circuits. This revelation is going to make you question everything you think you know about electrical safety around water. If you could somehow get perfectly pure water with absolutely no dissolved substances in it. You could drop a live electrical wire into it, and nothing would happen. The electricity wouldn't flow through the water, wouldn't create dangerous currents, and wouldn't electrocute anyone who touched it. The reason we associate water with electrical danger has nothing to do with water itself, and everything to do with what's dissolved in the water we encounter in real life. Tap water, pool water, ocean water, and even the water in your bathtub are all loaded with dissolved salts, minerals, and other substances that turn them into electrical conductors. It's these dissolved particles, called ions, that actually carry electrical current through water. Think about it this way. Pure water molecules are electrically neutral, which means they don't have the free, moving charged particles that electricity needs to flow through a material. But when you add salt, minerals, or other substances to water, you create ions that can move around and carry electrical charge. The more dissolved stuff in the water, the better it conducts electricity. This is why ocean water is such a good electrical conductor. It's absolutely packed with dissolved salts that create tons of mobile islands. Tap water contains minerals picked up from pipes and treatment processes, making it moderately conductive. Even rainwater becomes slightly conductive after picking up particles from the atmosphere as it falls. But here's where this gets really fascinating from a chemistry perspective. The conductivity of water changes dramatically based on what's dissolved in it. Distilled water, which has had almost all dissolved substances removed, has electrical conductivity that's about 1,000,000 times lower than typical tap water. That's the difference between trying to push electricity through solid rubber versus copper wire. You can actually demonstrate this principle with a simple experiment that would have blown minds a century ago. If you take truly distilled water and try to light an LED bulb by running electricity through it, nothing happens. But add just a pinch of salt to that same water, and suddenly the LED lights up brightly as the dissolved salt ions start carrying electrical current. The reason this myth about water conducting electricity became so widespread is because it's based on a practical truth that got simplified into an inaccurate general principle. In the real world, every drop of water you encounter does conduct electricity because it's impossible to find naturally occurring pure water. Even the purest mountain spring water contains dissolved minerals that make it electrically conductive. So the safety warnings about water and electricity aren't wrong. They're just based on the practical reality that all real-world water is contaminated with dissolved substances. When safety experts tell you that water conducts electricity, they're not talking about the theoretical properties of pure H2O molecules. They're talking about the actual water that exists in your home, your swimming pool, and your environment. This distinction between pure water and real world water reveals something important about how scientific facts get translated into practical safety rules. Sometimes the simplified version becomes the accepted truth, even when it's technically inaccurate, because the simplified version is more useful for keeping people safe. Understanding the real science behind water conductivity actually makes electrical safety more interesting rather than less important. It helps you understand why some water is more dangerous than others. Salt water is incredibly conductive and extremely dangerous around electricity. Tap water is moderately conductive and still hazardous. Even relatively pure water can become dangerous if it picks up dissolved substances from whatever it's touching. The water conductivity myth also explains some seemingly contradictory things you might have noticed. Electronics manufacturers can safely clean circuit boards with distilled water, but they'd never use tap water. Laboratory workers can handle certain electrical equipment around ultra-pure water, but they'd never do the same around ordinary drinking water. What makes this scientific truth particularly striking is that it shows how the properties of pure substances can be completely different from the properties of those same substances in the real world, where nothing is ever truly pure. You can see the Great Wall of China from the moon. Stand outside on a clear night and look up at the moon. From where you're standing, that glowing disk looks pretty big and detailed, right? You can make out dark patches, bright areas, and maybe even some surface features if your eyesight is good. Now imagine someone telling you that from that same moon, which is 239,000 miles away, you could look back at Earth and spot a narrow wall running across China with your naked eye. This claim has been repeated so many times in classrooms and tourist brochures that it's become one of the most famous facts about human construction. The moon visibility claim is so spectacularly impossible that it violates basic laws of physics and human vision. From the moon, Earth appears smaller than a marble held at arm's length. At that distance, you can't even clearly distinguish individual continents with the naked eye, let alone identify a structure that's only about 20 feet wide. The Great Wall being visible from the moon is like claiming you could read newspaper headlines from the top of Mount Everest. Here's what's going to completely destroy your sense of scale and make this impossibility crystal clear. If the Great Wall were actually visible from the moon with the naked eye, then using that same logic, a human hair would be visible from over 2 miles away. A pencil line drawn on paper would be visible from several city blocks. Your shoelaces would be visible from airplane cruising altitude. None of these things are possible, because that's not how vision and distance work in the physical universe. The human eye has fundamental limits based on the physics of light and the biology of our visual system. There's a maximum resolution beyond which we simply cannot distinguish small objects from their background, no matter how good our eyesight is. This limit is determined by the size of light waves and the spacing of cells in our retinas. The Great Wall falls far below this resolution threshold when viewed from lunar distance. But here's where this myth gets even more ridiculous when you dig into the actual dimensions. The Great Wall averages about 20 feet in width, but it's not a continuous structure. It's a series of walls, gaps, reconstructed sections, and ruins that wind through mountainous terrain over thousands of miles. Much of the original wall has crumbled, been overgrown by vegetation, or blends completely into the surrounding landscape. From space, astronauts aboard the International Space Station, which orbits only 250 miles above Earth, have repeatedly confirmed that the Great Wall is nearly impossible to spot without telescopic assistance. These are trained observers with perfect viewing conditions, looking from a distance that's almost 1,000 times closer than the moon, and they still can't reliably identify the wall. The myth persists because it combines several elements that our brains find compelling. The Great Wall is genuinely impressive in length, stretching over 13,000 miles when you count all its branches and sections. The moon represents the ultimate distant viewpoint, the farthest humans have traveled from Earth. Combining these two superlatives creates a claim that sounds like it should be true, even when it's physically impossible. Tourist guides and educational materials have repeated this claim for decades because it makes the Great Wall sound uniquely spectacular. Saying that a human construction is visible from the moon implies a scale and grandeur that goes beyond normal architectural achievements. It transforms the wall from an impressive historical structure into something almost cosmic in significance. The moon visibility myth also reveals something fascinating about how we think about human achievements in space. We want our greatest constructions to be visible from our greatest traveling distance, as if this would somehow validate the significance of both accomplishments. The claim connects human engineering prowess with space exploration in a way that feels poetic and meaningful. But the truth is that no human construction is visible from the moon with the naked eye. Not the Great Wall, not the pyramids, not modern cities, not highway systems. From lunar distance, Earth appears as a small, blue sphere where individual human activities disappear into insignificance. This perspective isn't disappointing. It's actually profound in a completely different way. Understanding the impossible scale of the moon visibility claim forces us to confront the real relationship between human achievements and cosmic distances. Our greatest constructions, no matter how impressive they seem from ground level, become invisible dots when viewed from the scale of space. This doesn't diminish their importance, but it does put them in perspective. The Great Wall remains an incredible feat of human engineering and organization, representing centuries of construction and millions of workers across multiple dynasties. But its significance comes from its historical impact, cultural meaning, and the human stories behind its construction, not from fictional claims about space visibility that were never true in the first place. Bats are blind. The phrase blind as a bat has become so common that we use it without thinking. Parents tell kids not to feel around in the dark like a blind bat. Characters in movies stumble around saying they're as blind as a bat. The entire concept has become shorthand for having terrible vision, and it's reinforced every time we see cartoons of bats bumping into things or flying erratically because they supposedly can't see where they're going. This widely accepted comparison is completely backwards. Bats aren't blind. Most bat species actually have excellent eyesight, often better than humans in low light conditions. Some bats can see ultraviolet light that's completely invisible to human eyes. Others have night vision so sophisticated that they can navigate and hunt in conditions where humans would be completely helpless. Here's what's going to blow your mind about bat vision capabilities. Many bat species have eyes that are specially adapted for seeing in near total darkness. Their pupils can dilate much wider than human pupils, letting in more available light. Their retinas are packed with light, sensitive cells called rods that can detect even tiny amounts of illumination. Some fruit bats have color vision and can see details that would challenge human eyesight, even in daylight conditions. The confusion about bat blindness comes from our fascination with their incredible echolocation abilities. Bats can navigate and hunt using sound waves, creating detailed mental maps of their environment by listening to echoes bounce back from objects around them. This biological sonar system is so precise that bats can distinguish between different types of insects, avoid thin wires, and catch prey in complete darkness. But here's the crucial point that destroys the blindness myth. Bats don't use echolocation because they're blind. They use it because it gives them superpowers that vision alone could never provide. Echolocation allows bats to hunt in conditions where even perfect eyesight would be useless, detect objects behind them without turning around, and perceive details about texture density, and movement that visual information can't reveal. Think about how sophisticated this dual sensory system really is. A bat flying through a forest at night is simultaneously processing visual information about large obstacles, branches, and open spaces while using echolocation to track tiny flying insects that would be invisible even with perfect night vision. They're essentially running two advanced navigation systems at the same time, switching between them or combining them depending on what the situation requires. Different bat species actually rely on vision and echolocation in different proportions based on their hunting strategies and environments. Large fruit bats, called megabats, depend heavily on their excellent eyesight to locate ripe fruit and navigate between feeding trees. They use echolocation minimally or not at all. Smaller insect-eating bats rely more heavily on echolocation for hunting, but still use vision for general navigation and obstacle avoidance. The blind as a bat phrase probably originated from observations of bats flying in ways that seemed random or chaotic to human observers. People watching bats dart and dive erratically while chasing insects assumed this behavior indicated poor vision, when actually it demonstrated incredibly precise sensory control. Those seemingly random flight patterns are bats making split-second adjustments based on real-time echolocation data about moving prey. What makes this myth particularly ironic is that it completely undervalues one of nature's most impressive sensory achievements. Instead of marveling at creatures that have developed two sophisticated navigation systems, we've focused on the false idea that they're compensating for a disability. It's like looking at a fighter pilot using both visual instruments and radar, and concluding that pilots must be blind because they're not relying on vision alone. The bat blindness myth also reveals something interesting about how we categorize animal abilities. We tend to assume that animals must be either visual specialists or non-visual specialists, when many species actually combine multiple sensory systems in ways that exceed human capabilities. Bats represent a perfect example of sensory integration that goes far beyond human limits. Understanding the truth about bat vision changes how we think about adaptation and evolution. Bats didn't evolve echolocation to overcome blindness. They evolved it to exploit ecological niches that were unavailable to animals relying on vision alone. Their success comes from having more sensory information, not less. The real story of bat evolution is actually much more impressive than the compensation narrative suggested by the blindness myth. These animals developed one of the most sophisticated biological sensing systems on Earth while maintaining excellent vision capabilities, creating a combination that makes them incredibly effective predators and navigators in environments where other animals struggle to function. Seasons are caused by Earth's distance from the sun. Ask most people why we have seasons, and they'll give you what seems like a perfectly logical answer. During summer, Earth is closer to the sun, so it's warmer. During winter, Earth is farther away, so it's colder. This explanation feels so intuitive that even smart adults who should know better will confidently repeat it. After all, if you move closer to a campfire, you get warmer, and if you move away, you get colder. Basic physics, right? This seemingly obvious explanation is not just wrong. It's actually backwards in the most spectacular way possible. Earth is closest to the sun during winter in the northern hemisphere and farthest away during summer. The distance between Earth and the sun has almost nothing to do with seasonal temperature changes, and the real cause of seasons is going to completely flip your understanding of how our planet works. Here's what's actually happening. and it's going to make you see Earth's relationship with the Sun in a totally different way. Our planet is tilted on its axis by about 23.5 degrees, like a spinning top that's wobbling slightly. As Earth orbits the Sun throughout the year, this tilt means that different parts of the planet are angled toward or away from the Sun at different times. During summer in the northern hemisphere, the northern part of Earth is tilted toward the Sun, which means sunlight hits that region more directly and for longer periods each day. During winter, the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the Sun, so sunlight hits at a shallow angle and daylight hours are shorter. The southern hemisphere experiences exactly the opposite pattern, which is why Australia has summer when North America has winter. Think about this with a simple analogy that will make the tilt effect crystal clear. Hold a flashlight and shine it directly down on your hand. The light creates a bright, concentrated circle. Now tilt your hand so the light hits it at an angle. The same amount of light is now spread over a larger area, making it dimmer and less intense. That's exactly what happens to sunlight hitting different parts of Earth throughout the year. The distance factor that everyone assumes controls seasons is actually laughably small compared to the tilt effect. Earth's orbit is slightly elliptical, so our distance from the Sun does vary throughout the year, but only by about 3%. That tiny distance change causes a global temperature variation of maybe 2 or 3 degrees. Meanwhile, the tilt effect creates temperature swings of 30, 40, or even 50 degrees between summer and winter in many locations. But here's the kicker that proves how wrong the distance explanation really is. Earth reaches its closest point to the Sun, called perihelion, in early January. That's right in the middle of winter for most people reading this. If distance were the primary factor controlling seasons, January should be the hottest month of the year globally. Instead, it's when the northern hemisphere, where most of the world's population lives, experiences its coldest temperatures. The persistence of the distance myth reveals something fascinating about human intuition and how we extend everyday experiences to cosmic scales. The campfire analogy feels so perfect that we never question whether it applies to planetary mechanics. We assume that bigger versions of familiar phenomena work the same way as smaller versions, but space operates according to principles that often contradict our Earth-based intuitions. What makes this misconception particularly interesting is that it shows how we prefer simple, mechanical explanations over more complex geometric ones. Distance is easy to visualize and understand. Axial tilt requires you to think in 3 dimensions about angles, shadows, and the geometry of a spinning sphere orbiting another sphere. Our brains naturally gravitate toward the simpler explanation, even when it's completely wrong. The tilt explanation also reveals why seasons are more extreme at higher latitudes and barely exist near the equator. Places like Alaska experience dramatic seasonal changes because the tilt effect is most pronounced at the poles. Meanwhile, countries near the equator have consistent temperatures year-round because the Sun's angle doesn't change dramatically for them regardless of Earth's tilt. Understanding the true cause of seasons changes how you experience the natural world around you. When you notice the Sun taking a different path across the sky in winter versus summer, you're witnessing the evidence of Earth's tilt. When you see how shadows fall at different angles throughout the year, you're observing the geometric dance between our tilted planet and its star. The seasons myth is a perfect example of how our intuitive understanding of simple systems can lead us completely astray when applied to complex ones. Sometimes the most obvious explanation is not just wrong, but exactly backwards from reality. Toilet water spins differently in each hemisphere. There's a moment that happens to almost every tourist visiting the equator. A local guide demonstrates how water swirls clockwise on one side of the equatorial line and counterclockwise on the other side, dramatically proving that you're standing at the exact center of Earth's rotation. They'll pour water into a basin, show you the spin direction, walk 10 feet across the imaginary equator line, repeat the demonstration, and watch as the water magically spirals in the opposite direction. Crowds gather, cameras come out, and everyone walks away convinced they've witnessed the Coriolis effect in action. The entire demonstration is completely fake. Toilet water doesn't spin differently in different hemispheres. Neither does water going down drains, sinks, or any other small-scale water fixture in your house. The Coriolis effect is real, but it's so incredibly weak at the scale of toilets and bathtubs that it's completely overwhelmed by factors like the angle of water jets, the shape of the bowl, and which direction you happened to pour the water. Here's what's going to destroy your faith in those equator demonstrations and make you realize how you've been tricked by clever showmanship. The Coriolis effect only becomes noticeable over massive scales and long time periods. We're talking about weather systems that span hundreds of miles and develop over days or weeks. A toilet bowl is about 1 foot across, and the water drains in a matter of seconds. The Coriolis force at that scale is so ridiculously tiny that it's like trying to steer a cruise ship by blowing on the sails. To put this in perspective, the Coriolis effect on a draining bathtub is about 10 million times weaker than the effect of simply walking past the tub while it's draining. The tiny air currents created by your movement have more influence on water spin direction than the rotation of the entire planet. A slight breeze, an uneven surface, or residual motion from filling the basin will completely overpower any theoretical Coriolis influence. But here's where those equator demonstrations become really interesting as exercises in deception rather than science. The guides performing these tricks are using carefully designed setups to control which direction the water spins. They might have hidden jets that create circulation, asymmetrical drain holes, or they might be subtly tilting the basin in different directions. The location relative to the equator has absolutely nothing to do with the results they're showing you. The real Coriolis effect is actually fascinating when it operates at the scales where it matters. Large weather systems like hurricanes do indeed rotate differently in different hemispheres because they're massive enough and long, lasting enough for Earth's rotation to influence their development. In the northern hemisphere, hurricanes spin counterclockwise, while in the southern hemisphere, they spin clockwise. This happens because Earth's rotation creates apparent forces that deflect moving objects over large distances. Air masses moving across hundreds of miles over several days experience enough Coriolis deflection to create the characteristic spiral patterns we see in satellite images of major storms. But this same effect is completely negligible for water moving a few inches over a few seconds. The toilet spin myth probably gained popularity because it makes the abstract concept of Earth's rotation feel tangible and observable in everyday life. People want to believe they can see evidence of cosmic forces in their bathroom, that something as mundane as flushing a toilet connects them to the grand mechanics of planetary motion. It's a romantic idea that makes ordinary activities feel connected to the universe. Tour guides at equatorial locations have strong financial incentives to perpetuate this myth because it creates a memorable experience that justifies the trip. Telling tourists that they can witness a fundamental force of physics just by crossing an imaginary line is much more exciting than explaining that the equator is primarily significant for navigation and timekeeping purposes. What makes this myth particularly frustrating for scientists is that it takes a real, important physical phenomenon and trivializes it through false everyday examples. The Coriolis effect genuinely influences weather patterns, ocean currents, and ballistic trajectories over large scales. But by associating it with toilet bowls and sink drains, the myth makes it seem like a parlor trick rather than a fundamental aspect of planetary physics. Understanding the truth about the Coriolis effect and small-scale water drainage actually makes the real phenomenon more impressive. The fact that Earth's rotation can influence massive weather systems spanning continents while having zero effect on your bathtub demonstrates the incredible range of scales at which different physical forces operate. The toilet spin myth is a perfect example of how we sometimes want simple demonstrations of complex phenomena so badly that we accept fake evidence rather than acknowledging that some things can't be easily observed in everyday situations. Sugar makes kids hyperactive. Every parent has lived through this nightmare scenario. You take your perfectly well-behaved child to a birthday party, they demolish a piece of cake loaded with frosting, and within minutes, they're bouncing off the walls like a caffeinated pinball. They're running in circles, talking nonstop, and displaying energy levels that seem physically impossible for someone their size. You shake your head knowingly and blame the sugar rush, joining millions of other parents who've witnessed this exact transformation countless times. The connection between sugar and hyperactivity seems so obvious that questioning it feels like denying gravity. But here's something that's going to completely shatter your understanding of childhood behavior and parental assumptions. Multiple large-scale scientific studies involving thousands of children have found no reliable connection between sugar consumption and hyperactive behavior. None. The sugar rush that seems so real and so obvious is actually a psychological illusion. Here's what's going to blow your mind about how researchers tested this sugar hyperactivity connection. Scientists designed carefully controlled experiments where children were given either sugary drinks or artificially sweetened drinks that tasted identical, and neither the kids nor their parents knew which group was which. Then trained observers who also didn't know which children had consumed sugar watched the kids play and rated their behavior for hyperactivity, attention problems, and energy levels. The results were shocking. There was no difference in behavior between children who had consumed sugar and children who had received artificial sweeteners. The kids who got sugar weren't more hyperactive, more distractible, or more energetic than the kids who got fake sugar. Even when researchers increased the sugar doses to levels far beyond what kids would normally consume, they still found no behavioral changes. But here's where this gets really fascinating from a psychology perspective. When researchers repeated these same experiments, but told parents which children had received sugar, suddenly the parents reported dramatic increases in hyperactive behavior in those kids. The parents were seeing hyperactivity that wasn't actually there, based purely on their expectations about what sugar should do. This reveals something incredible about human perception and confirmation bias. When parents expect their children to become hyperactive after eating sugar, they unconsciously start interpreting normal childhood energy and excitement as evidence of a sugar rush. They notice the running around while ignoring the moments of calm. They remember the loud talking, but forget the quiet playing. Their brains are selectively filtering information to confirm what they already believe. Think about the context where most sugar consumption happens for children: birthday parties, holidays, special celebrations, and fun outings. These are naturally exciting environments that would make any child more energetic and enthusiastic, regardless of what they're eating. Kids get excited about parties, presents, games, and social interaction. The sugar just happens to be present during these naturally stimulating situations. The timing of sugar metabolism also doesn't match the supposed hyperactivity timeline. When you eat sugar, it gets absorbed into your bloodstream relatively quickly, but your body immediately starts regulating blood sugar levels through insulin release. Any energy boost from sugar consumption is typically mild and short-lived, lasting maybe 30 to 60 minutes at most. But parents often report sugar-induced hyperactivity lasting for hours, which doesn't match the biological reality of how sugar affects the body. The sugar hyperactivity myth probably started as a reasonable hypothesis that never got properly tested before becoming accepted wisdom. Parents noticed correlations between sweet treats and excited behavior, made logical assumptions about cause and effect, and started sharing these observations with other parents. Once the idea took hold in parenting culture, it became self-reinforcing through confirmation bias and selective attention. Food marketers inadvertently strengthened this belief by creating products specifically designed to appeal to the idea of sugar rushes. Energy drinks, candy bars, and sugary snacks are often marketed with imagery of explosive energy, lightning bolts, and extreme activity levels. This advertising reinforces the cultural connection between sugar and hyperactivity, even though the products don't actually deliver the promised energy effects. What makes this myth particularly harmful is that it can create unnecessary anxiety around childhood nutrition and lead to overly restrictive approaches to treating kids. Some parents become so worried about sugar-induced behavior problems that they create elaborate rules and restrictions that might actually be more stressful for children than the sugar consumption they're trying to prevent. Understanding the truth about sugar and behavior can actually improve family dynamics and reduce parental stress. When you realize that your child's excited behavior at parties is probably due to the social stimulation and fun environment rather than the cake they ate, you can respond more appropriately and enjoy these moments rather than dreading them. The sugar hyperactivity myth is a perfect example of how correlation can be mistaken for causation, especially when the correlation fits our existing beliefs and the real causes are more complex and less obvious than we'd like them to be. Alcohol warms you up. There's a reason why St. Bernard rescue dogs in old cartoons carry little barrels of brandy around their necks. For centuries, mountain rescue teams actually carried alcohol to give to hypothermia victims, believing it would warm them up and potentially save their lives. Ski lodges still serve hot toddies to cold skiers, and people everywhere reach for whiskey or rum when they're feeling chilled. This warming tradition is so deeply embedded in human culture that we rarely question whether alcohol actually makes us warmer. Prepare to have your understanding of alcohol and body temperature completely shattered. Alcohol doesn't warm you up at all. In fact, it does the exact opposite. Drinking alcohol when you're cold actually makes you lose body heat faster and increases your risk of hypothermia. Those St. Bernard dogs with brandy barrels weren't carrying life-saving medicine. They were carrying a substance that could literally kill the people they were trying to rescue. Here's the terrifying science behind what alcohol actually does to your body temperature regulation. When you drink alcohol, it causes your blood vessels near the skin's surface to dilate, which means they open up wider than normal. This dilation creates a rush of warm blood to your skin, giving you that immediate sensation of warmth and often causing your face and skin to feel flushed and heated. But here's the deadly trick your body is playing on you. That warm feeling isn't your body temperature going up. It's your core body heat rushing to the surface, where it can escape into the environment much more easily. It's like opening all the windows in your house during winter and then wondering why your heating bill skyrockets. You feel warmer initially because heat is flowing past your skin's temperature sensors, but you're actually losing that precious warmth to the surrounding air at an accelerated rate. Your body normally keeps your core temperature stable by restricting blood flow to your extremities when it's cold. This is why your hands and feet get cold first during winter. It's your body's smart strategy for preserving heat where it matters most, around your vital organs. Alcohol completely sabotages this survival mechanism by forcing your body to pump warm blood to your skin regardless of the external temperature. The result is that your core temperature can drop dangerously low while you feel deceivingly warm on the surface. This false sensation of warmth can lead people to make terrible decisions in cold environments, like removing clothing, staying outside longer than safe, or not seeking proper shelter. In extreme cases, this alcohol-induced heat loss has contributed to deaths from hypothermia in people who thought they were warming themselves up. Mountain rescue teams discovered this deadly truth through tragic experience. They found that giving alcohol to hypothermia victims often made their condition worse, not better. The temporary warming sensation masked the fact that the person's core temperature was continuing to drop. Modern rescue protocols now specifically warn against giving alcohol to cold or hypothermic individuals because it can accelerate heat loss at the exact moment when preserving body heat is most critical. The alcohol warming myth is so persistent because the initial sensation is genuinely convincing. When you take a sip of whiskey on a cold day, you really do feel warmer within minutes. Your skin temperature actually increases, your face might flush, and you get that cozy, heated feeling spreading through your body. The problem is that this short-term sensation completely masks the longer-term cooling effect that follows. It's similar to how a fever makes you feel hot, even though your body is actually trying to raise its temperature to fight infection. Your sensory experience doesn't always accurately reflect what's happening to your overall thermal regulation. In the case of alcohol, your heat sensors are detecting the movement of warm blood to your skin, but they can't detect that this same process is causing you to lose heat to the environment more rapidly. What makes this myth particularly dangerous is that it encourages risky behavior in situations where body temperature management can be life-threatening. People hiking, skiing, or working outdoors in cold conditions might rely on alcohol for warmth instead of proper clothing, shelter, or heating methods. This false confidence can lead to prolonged exposure in dangerous conditions. The truth about alcohol and body temperature is actually more nuanced than either complete warming or complete cooling. In very controlled, indoor environments, the temporary warming sensation might provide psychological comfort without significant heat loss. But in any situation where you're actually cold due to environmental conditions, alcohol becomes a thermal liability rather than an asset. Understanding this physiological reality can literally save lives and definitely prevents poor decision making in cold weather situations. The next time you're tempted to use alcohol as a warming strategy, remember that your body's heat sensors are lying to you about what's actually happening to your core temperature. Touching a baby bird makes its mother abandon it. You're walking through the park when you spot a tiny baby bird on the ground, clearly fallen from its nest. Your first instinct is to help, but then that voice in your head kicks in, the one that's been drilled into you since childhood. Don't touch it. If you touch that bird, you'll leave your human scent on it, and the mother will reject it forever. You walk away feeling terrible, convinced that helping would actually doom the creature you're trying to save. This scenario plays out millions of times every spring, and it's based on one of the most harmful wildlife myths ever created. Here's what's going to completely change how you think about bird parenting and animal rescue. Touching a baby bird will not cause its mother to abandon it. This belief is not just wrong. It so fundamentally misunderstands how birds operate that it's probably caused more animal deaths than it's prevented. Mother birds don't abandon their babies because of human scent, and the idea that they would reveals a shocking ignorance about how bird senses actually work. Let me explain exactly why this myth is ridiculous from a bird's biological perspective. Most birds have an extremely poor sense of smell compared to mammals. Their brains dedicate very little processing power to analyzing scents because they rely primarily on vision and hearing to navigate their world. A robin or sparrow couldn't detect human scent on their baby even if they wanted to, because their olfactory systems simply aren't sophisticated enough to pick up and analyze complex scent signatures. The few bird species that do have decent smell capabilities, like vultures and some seabirds, use this sense to locate food sources over vast distances, not to conduct detailed scent analysis of their offspring. Even these sensitive birds show no evidence of rejecting their young based on foreign odors. Bird parenting is driven by much stronger instincts than scent detection. Here's what actually drives bird parenting behavior, and it's going to make you realize how incredibly dedicated these creatures are to their offspring. Mother birds invest enormous amounts of energy into raising their young. They spend weeks building nests, incubating eggs, and then feeding hungry chicks every few minutes from dawn to dusk. This level of parental investment doesn't get abandoned lightly over something as trivial as an unfamiliar smell. Birds identify their babies through a combination of location, visual recognition, and vocal calls. Baby birds have specific begging calls that trigger feeding responses in their parents, and parent birds learn to recognize the unique vocal signatures of their own chicks. This system is so robust that it works even when baby birds temporarily leave the nest, which happens naturally as part of their development process. The truth about baby birds on the ground is actually more complex and interesting than the simple "don't touch" rule suggests. Many baby birds spend time on the ground as part of their normal development. These fledglings have left the nest but can't yet fly properly, so they hop around on the ground while their parents continue to feed and protect them from nearby perches. What looks like an abandoned baby bird is often just a young bird learning to be independent while still under parental supervision. But here's where the "don't touch" myth becomes genuinely harmful. When people find injured baby birds and refuse to help them because of scent fears, those birds often die from injuries or exposure that could have been easily treated. Wildlife rehabilitators constantly encounter situations where meaning people left injured birds to suffer rather than risk causing parental abandonment that was never going to happen anyway. The myth probably originated from a combination of factors that made it seem logical to previous generations. People noticed that sometimes baby birds disappeared after being handled, so they assumed the handling caused the abandonment. But baby birds have naturally high mortality rates due to predation, disease, and environmental factors. Correlation got confused with causation, and the myth was born. Parents and teachers started repeating this rule because it seemed like a safe way to prevent children from disturbing wildlife unnecessarily. It's easier to say don't touch or the mother will abandon it than to explain the complex realities of when human intervention is helpful versus harmful. The myth became a simple rule that achieved the goal of reducing human interference with wildlife, even though it was based on completely false assumptions. What's actually true is that most baby birds are better off being left alone, but not because of scent issues. It's because most of them aren't actually in trouble and don't need human help. The best approach is to observe from a distance first to determine whether the bird is truly injured or abandoned before deciding whether intervention is necessary. Understanding the reality of bird parenting and sensory capabilities can help you make better decisions when you encounter wildlife. You don't need to be paralyzed by fear of leaving scent traces, but you should still be thoughtful about when human intervention is actually beneficial versus when it's just disrupting natural processes. Humans didn't have contact with Neanderthals. For over a century, scientists taught us that Neanderthals were a completely separate branch of human evolution that went extinct without ever successfully interacting with modern humans. We imagined them as primitive, isolated cousins who lived in different parts of the world and died out long before our ancestors could meet them. Museums displayed Neanderthal exhibits as evolutionary dead ends, and textbooks described them as failed experiments in human development who left no lasting impact on our species. Then in 2010, scientists cracked the Neanderthal genome, and what they discovered absolutely revolutionized everything we thought we knew about human history. Not only did our ancestors have contact with Neanderthals, they had intimate contact with them. They lived together, hunted together, shared territories, and most shocking of all, they had children together. If you have European or Asian ancestry, you're literally part Neanderthal right now. The genetic evidence is so overwhelming that it's impossible to ignore. Most people of non-African descent carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. That might not sound like much, but it represents thousands of genetic variants that influence everything from your immune system to your hair texture to how your body processes certain foods. These aren't random genetic accidents. They're the direct result of successful interbreeding between our species over thousands of years. Here's what's truly mind-blowing about this discovery. The genetic mixing wasn't a rare, isolated event that happened once or twice in human history. It was extensive and ongoing for millennia. Modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted in Europe and parts of Asia for over 10,000 years, and during that entire period, they were regularly producing hybrid offspring who survived, thrived, and passed on their mixed genetics to future generations. Scientists can now trace specific Neanderthal gene variants in modern populations and see exactly how they spread through human communities. Some Neanderthal genes provided advantages for surviving in cold climates. Others boosted immune system responses to European diseases, and still others influenced skin and hair characteristics that were beneficial in northern latitudes. Natural selection actively preserved these Neanderthal traits because they helped our ancestors survive in environments where pure modern human genetics might have been inadequate. The implications of this genetic mixing are staggering when you really think about them. It means that Neanderthals didn't go extinct in the way we traditionally imagine extinction. Instead, they were essentially absorbed into the modern human population through interbreeding. Their genes, their adaptations, and their evolutionary innovations live on inside millions of people walking around today. But the genetic evidence is just the beginning of how wrong we got this story. Archaeological discoveries have revealed that Neanderthals and modern humans shared similar technologies, created comparable art forms, and even used the same burial practices in some regions. At sites across Europe, researchers have found mixed tool assemblages that show both species were using and improving upon each other's innovations. The old narrative painted Neanderthals as brutish cave dwellers who were quickly outcompeted by superior modern humans. The reality is that they were sophisticated people with advanced tool-making skills, complex social structures, and adaptive strategies that were so successful that modern humans adopted many of them. In some ways, the relationship was less like conquest and more like merger. Here's where this gets really fascinating from an evolutionary perspective. The successful interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals suggests that we weren't actually separate species in the traditional biological sense. Most species can't produce fertile offspring when they mate with other species. The fact that human Neanderthal hybrids were not only viable but successful enough to pass on their genes indicates that the genetic differences between us were relatively minor. This realization has forced scientists to completely rethink what we mean by human species and human evolution. Instead of a clean family tree with distinct branches, human development looks more like a complex web of interconnected populations that regularly exchange genes, technologies, and cultural innovations. Neanderthals weren't our distant cousins who disappeared. They were our neighbors, partners, and in many cases, the ancestors of our ancestors. The old story of separate human species persisted for so long because it fit nicely into outdated ideas about evolution as a linear progression toward modern perfection. We wanted to believe that modern humans represented the pinnacle of evolutionary success, which required making Neanderthals into evolutionary failures. But evolution doesn't work that way, and genetic evidence has proven that successful adaptation often involves mixing, not isolation. Understanding the truth about Neanderthal integration changes how we think about human diversity, adaptation, and what it means to be human in the first place. Ostriches bury their heads in the sand. Picture an ostrich that spots a lion approaching across the African savanna. According to popular belief, this 8-foot tall bird immediately panics and sticks its head deep into the sand, somehow believing that if it can't see the predator can't see it. This image is so ridiculous that we use it as a metaphor for willful ignorance and avoiding problems. Politicians bury their heads in the sand. Companies bury their heads in the sand. But actual ostriches definitely do not bury their heads in the sand. And the real truth about ostrich behavior is going to make you question where this absurd myth even came from. here's what's going to completely destroy this cartoon version of ostrich intelligence. Ostriches are actually one of the most alert and practical birds on the planet. When they encounter danger, they do the exact opposite of hiding their heads. They use their incredible height advantage to scan for threats across vast distances, and when serious danger appears, they run away at speeds up to 45 miles per hour. An ostrich that buried its head in the sand would be a dead ostrich within minutes. Let me explain what ostriches actually do that might have contributed to this myth, because their real behavior is far more intelligent and interesting. Ostriches spend significant time with their heads close to or on the ground, but not because they're hiding from predators. They're either feeding on plants and insects, drinking water, or most importantly, tending to their nests and eggs. Ostrich nests are shallow depressions scraped into the ground, and both male and female ostriches regularly lower their heads to turn their eggs, adjust nest materials, and check on developing chicks. From a distance, especially through heat shimmer or poor visibility conditions, this nest-tending behavior might look like the bird is burying its head in the ground. But what's actually happening is careful, attentive parenting. Here's where ostrich behavior gets really fascinating and completely contradicts the head burying stereotype. When ostriches detect potential threats, they employ a sophisticated early warning system that would make military strategists jealous. Their eyes are larger than their brains and can spot movement from over 2 miles away. They often serve as lookouts for other animals in their ecosystem, with zebras, antelopes, and other species staying near ostriches specifically because they're such effective sentries. If an ostrich spots danger and determines that running isn't the best option, they have several defensive strategies that are way smarter than head burying. They can deliver kicks powerful enough to kill a lion, with claws that can slice through metal. They also use intimidation displays, spreading their wings wide and making themselves look even larger and more threatening. Sometimes they lie flat against the ground with their necks extended, using their mottled coloring to blend into the landscape from a distance. That last behavior is probably the closest thing to what people imagine when they think of head burying, but it's actually the opposite of hiding. When an ostrich lies flat with its neck stretched out, it's not sticking its head in the sand, it's positioning itself to maintain visual contact with potential threats while minimizing its profile. It's a calculated camouflage technique, not a panic response. The head burying myth seems to have originated from ancient Roman writings, where Pliny the Elder described ostriches as believing they were hidden when they stuck their heads into bushes. Even this early account wasn't about sand, and it was probably based on misunderstood observations of the camouflage behavior I just described. Over centuries of retelling, bushes became sand, and strategic positioning became mindless panic. What makes this myth particularly unfair to ostriches is that it portrays them as cowardly and stupid when they're actually remarkably brave and intelligent birds. Ostrich parents will aggressively defend their nests against much larger predators, including humans. They show complex social behaviors, form long-term pair bonds, and demonstrate problem-solving abilities that rival many mammals. The persistence of the ostrich head burying myth says more about human psychology than ostrich behavior. We love simple metaphors for complex human behaviors, and the image of hiding your head in the sand perfectly captures the idea of avoiding uncomfortable realities. The metaphor is so useful that we've kept it alive long after learning It's based on completely false animal behavior. Understanding what ostriches actually do when threatened reveals that nature rarely rewards hiding from problems. Successful survival strategies involve awareness, preparation, and decisive action when danger appears. These are lessons that apply far beyond the African savanna, and they come from observing what these remarkable birds really do rather than what we imagine they do. The next time someone accuses you of burying your head in the sand, you can tell them that real ostriches are far too smart for that kind of behavior. Chameleons change color to camouflage. Imagine you're watching a nature documentary, and a chameleon slowly creeps across a branch, magically shifting from brown to green to match the leaves around it. The narrator explains how this incredible camouflage ability helps the lizard become invisible to predators and prey. It's one of nature's most famous examples of adaptive camouflage, repeated in countless wildlife shows, children's books, and science classes. The only problem with this beautiful story is that it's almost completely backwards from what chameleons actually do with their color-changing abilities. Brace yourself for a revelation that's going to flip everything you think you know about these fascinating creatures. Chameleons don't primarily change color for camouflage. They change color to regulate their body temperature, communicate with other chameleons, and express their emotional states. The camouflage function that everyone talks about is actually one of the least important reasons these animals shift their appearance. Here's what's really happening inside a chameleon's skin when it changes color, and the science is absolutely incredible. Chameleons have specialized cells called chromatophores that contain different colored pigments and reflective crystals. These cells can expand and contract in response to temperature changes, hormonal fluctuations, and neural signals from the brain. When a chameleon gets hot, it might turn lighter colors to reflect more sunlight and cool down. When it gets cold, it shifts to darker colors to absorb more heat energy. But temperature regulation is just the beginning. Chameleons use color changes as a sophisticated communication system that's like having a built-in mood ring and social media platform combined. A male chameleon approaching a potential mate might display brilliant reds, oranges, and yellows to show he's healthy and interested. If another male challenges him, he might shift to aggressive dark colors with contrasting stripes to signal dominance and territorial ownership. Female chameleons have their own color vocabulary. When they're receptive to mating, they display specific color patterns that males recognize as invitation signals. When they're pregnant or not interested, they shift to different combinations that clearly communicate rejection. Stressed chameleons turn dark, excited chameleons brighten up, and sick chameleons often lose their ability to change colors effectively. The real kicker about chameleon camouflage is that most chameleon species are actually already well camouflaged in their natural resting colors. They don't need to actively change to match their environment, because they've evolved base colorations that blend perfectly with their typical habitats. Many chameleons spend most of their time looking like bark, leaves, or branches without any active color adjustment at all. When chameleons do change colors, they often become more visible, not less visible. A chameleon displaying bright mating colors or aggressive territorial patterns is deliberately making itself stand out from the background. It's like the difference between wearing camouflage gear and wearing a neon sign. The goal isn't to hide, it's to communicate. Here's where the camouflage myth probably came from. and it reveals something interesting about how we project human logic onto animal behavior. Early observers noticed that chameleons could change color and that they were often hard to spot in trees, so they assumed the color changing was for hiding. It seemed like such an obvious evolutionary advantage that nobody questioned whether camouflage was actually the primary function. The myth was reinforced by the fact that chameleons do sometimes use color changes defensively, but not in the way most people imagine. When truly threatened, many chameleons turn very dark colors and puff up their bodies to look larger and more intimidating. This isn't camouflage, it's the opposite. They're trying to look as scary and noticeable as possible to deter potential threats. What makes this misconception particularly interesting is that we've completely overlooked the most amazing aspects of chameleon color changing by focusing on the least important function. The idea that these creatures have a complex emotional and social life expressed through rapidly shifting colors is far more fascinating than simple camouflage. They're basically living mood lamps with sophisticated communication systems. Understanding the truth about chameleon color changes reveals how often we misinterpret animal behavior by assuming it serves the purposes we'd expect rather than observing what the animals actually use these abilities for. We see a color-changing animal and immediately think camouflage, because that's what we'd use color changing for if we had the ability. The reality is that nature develops incredible abilities for reasons that are often completely different from our assumptions, and chameleons are perfect examples of how evolution creates solutions that are more complex and interesting than the simple survival stories we usually tell ourselves. Hair and nails keep growing after death. Medieval gravediggers used to tell stories about opening old coffins and finding corpses with impossibly long fingernails and hair that had grown wild in the darkness. These tales became part of folklore, contributing to vampire legends and ghost stories about the restless dead. Even today, morticians and forensic investigators occasionally encounter family members who are convinced they've witnessed posthumous hair and nail growth when viewing bodies days or weeks after death. The image is so unsettling and seemingly supernatural that it's become one of our most persistent beliefs about what happens to our bodies after we die. Here's what's going to completely shatter this creepy misconception and replace it with something far more scientifically fascinating. Hair and nails do not continue growing after death. They cannot continue growing after death. What people observe and interpret as growth is actually the result of a completely different process that has nothing to do with continued cellular activity and everything to do with the dramatic changes that happen to human tissue when life support systems shut down. Let me explain exactly what's happening to create this convincing illusion, because the real science is more remarkable than any supernatural explanation. When someone dies, their heart stops pumping blood, which means cells throughout the body stop receiving oxygen and nutrients. Without these essential supplies, cellular activity ceases almost immediately. Hair follicles and nail beds require constant energy and protein synthesis to produce new growth, and both of these processes stop completely when blood circulation ends. But here's where your body plays an incredible trick that fools even trained professionals sometimes. As the body dehydrates after death, the skin begins to shrink and pull back from hair shafts and nail beds. This retraction exposes parts of hair and nails that were previously hidden beneath the skin's surface, creating the illusion that they've grown longer. It's like watching a magic trick where a coin appears to grow larger when it's actually just getting closer to your eyes. The effect is particularly noticeable around fingernails and toenails because the skin at nail beds is relatively thin and retracts significantly during dehydration. Nails that appeared to end at the fingertip during life suddenly seem to extend well beyond it, sometimes by several millimeters. Hair shows a similar effect, especially facial hair, where skin retraction can expose hair shafts that were embedded below the surface when the person was alive. This skin shrinkage happens surprisingly quickly after death, which is why the growth illusion can be observed within days rather than weeks or months. The process is accelerated by environmental factors like dry air, heat, or embalming procedures that remove moisture from tissues. The drier the conditions, the more dramatic the apparent growth appears. Understanding this process reveals something fascinating about how our bodies are constructed. Even during life, significant portions of our hair shafts and nail plates exist below the visible skin surface. We're only seeing the tips of much longer structures, and when the skin pulls back, it reveals the hidden architecture that was there all along. The medieval gravediggers who started these stories weren't lying or imagining things. They were making logical observations based on what they could see, but they lacked the scientific knowledge to understand the dehydration and skin retraction process. In their world, supernatural explanations for unusual phenomena were much more common than detailed biological analysis. What makes this myth particularly persistent is that it touches on deep human anxieties about death and the unknown. The idea that some part of us continues functioning after death, even if it's just hair and nail growth, provides a weird kind of comfort. It suggests that death isn't a complete cessation of all biological activity, which makes the transition seem less final and absolute. But the truth is actually more profound than the myth. The skin retraction that creates this illusion is part of the same process that eventually returns our bodies to the earth and cycles our biological materials back into the ecosystem. It's not evidence of continued life, it's evidence of the elegant way nature recycles everything, ensuring that nothing is ever truly wasted. The hair and nail growth myth is a perfect example of how our pattern-seeking brains can misinterpret visual evidence. When we don't understand the underlying mechanisms, we see what looks like growth and assume growth is happening, when what we're actually witnessing is the revelation of structures that were hidden during life. Recognizing this illusion for what it is doesn't make death any less mysterious or meaningful, but it does help us appreciate the remarkable processes that shape our bodies both during life and after it ends. Lemmings commit mass suicide. In 1958, Disney released a nature documentary called White Wilderness that featured one of the most shocking wildlife sequences ever filmed. Hundreds of lemmings were shown marching in a straight line toward a cliff edge, and then throwing themselves into the ocean below in an apparent act of mass suicide. The footage was so dramatic and disturbing that it created an instant cultural phenomenon. The idea of lemming mass suicide became a powerful metaphor for mindless group behavior, and for decades, people used the phrase like lemmings to describe anyone blindly following others into disaster. What I'm about to tell you is going to completely destroy your faith in documentary filmmaking and reveal one of the most shameful moments in nature programming history. Those lemmings didn't commit suicide, they were pushed. Disney filmmakers literally purchased lemmings from local children, transported them to the filming location, and then used turntables and manual force to drive the terrified animals off the cliff while cameras rolled. The entire sequence was staged, and the mass suicide behavior that millions of people witnessed was pure Hollywood fiction. Here's the truth about actual lemming behavior that Disney completely ignored in their rush to create dramatic footage. Lemmings are small Arctic rodents that live in cyclical population booms and crashes based on food availability and predator pressure. During population peaks, large groups of lemmings do migrate in search of new territory and food sources. Sometimes these migrations involve crossing rivers or navigating difficult terrain where some individuals might accidentally drown or fall from heights. But accidental deaths during migration are completely different from deliberate mass suicide. Real lemmings are actually excellent swimmers who can cross substantial bodies of water when necessary. They're also smart enough to avoid obvious dangers like cliff edges when they have other options available. The dramatic cliff diving behavior that Disney filmed has never been observed in wild lemming populations under natural conditions. The Disney documentary was filmed in Alberta, Canada, where the specific lemming species they used doesn't even naturally occur. The filmmakers imported the animals specifically for the shoot, which means the lemmings were already stressed, disoriented, and completely outside their natural habitat before the cameras started rolling. Under normal circumstances, these lemmings would never have been anywhere near the cliff location where the infamous scene was shot. What makes this documentary fraud even more disturbing is how it shaped public perception of animal behavior for generations. The lemming suicide myth became so embedded in popular culture that it influenced everything from business terminology to political commentary. People started using lemming behavior as shorthand for mindless conformity and self-destructive group dynamics, all based on footage of animals being forced to perform unnatural behaviors by human filmmakers. The real tragedy is that actual lemming behavior is far more interesting and complex than the suicide myth suggests. Lemmings have sophisticated social structures, complex mating rituals, and remarkable adaptations for surviving in harsh Arctic environments. During their natural population cycles, they demonstrate incredible resilience and resourcefulness, finding new territories and establishing thriving colonies even under challenging conditions. Arctic researchers who study wild lemming populations describe them as cautious, intelligent animals that carefully assess risks before making decisions about movement and territory. They're survivors, not suicidal creatures driven by mysterious death wishes. When lemming populations crash, it's typically due to natural factors like food scarcity, disease, or increased predation, not mass self-destruction. The Disney documentary scandal wasn't revealed until decades later, when investigative journalists started digging into the production methods used in White Wilderness. They discovered that multiple scenes in the film were staged or manipulated, but the lemming sequence was by far the most egregious example of fake nature footage passed off as documentary reality. This revelation should have been a major scandal that changed how we think about nature documentaries. But somehow the lemming suicide myth persisted even after the truth came out. The fake footage was so memorable and the metaphor so useful that people continued referencing lemming behavior long after learning it was fabricated. Understanding the truth about lemmings reveals something disturbing about how easily manipulated footage can create lasting beliefs about the natural world. It makes you wonder how many other animal behaviors we accept as fact are actually the result of human interference or misinterpretation rather than genuine wildlife observation. The lemming myth is a perfect example of how entertainment can override science when the story is compelling enough. We wanted to believe in an animal that demonstrated the dangers of blind conformity, so we accepted footage that confirmed our preconceptions without questioning how or why it was obtained. Real lemmings deserve better than being remembered as suicidal followers when they're actually resourceful survivors navigating one of the planet's most challenging environments. If you drop a penny from a skyscraper, it can kill someone. You're standing on the observation deck of the Empire State Building, and someone next to you pulls out a penny and jokes about dropping it. Immediately, half the people around start panicking, warning that the coin could turn into a deadly projectile that kills an innocent pedestrian 1,000 feet below. This scenario has become so embedded in urban legend that many tall buildings have installed protective barriers, specifically to prevent people from accidentally creating penny-shaped missiles. The physics sounds logical enough. Gravity plus height equals devastating impact, right? Here's what's going to completely destroy this urban myth and probably make you question every other physics fact you learned from movies. A penny dropped from any height, including the tallest skyscraper on Earth, cannot kill a person. It can't even seriously injure someone. In fact, if a penny fell from the Empire State Building and hit you on the head, you'd probably barely feel it, and you definitely wouldn't need medical attention. Let me explain the physics that make this seemingly dangerous scenario completely harmless, because the science behind falling objects is way more interesting than the Hollywood version. When any object falls through air, it doesn't just accelerate indefinitely due to gravity. Air resistance, also called drag, pushes back against the falling object with increasing force as its speed increases. Eventually, these two forces balance out, and the object reaches what's called terminal velocity, where it stops accelerating and falls at a constant speed. For a penny, which weighs only about 2.5 grams and has a relatively large surface area compared to its mass, terminal velocity is reached very quickly and tops out at around 30 to 50 miles per hour depending on how it's oriented during the fall. That might sound fast, but it's nowhere near the bone-crushing speeds that the myth suggests. A penny hitting you at terminal velocity would feel similar to someone flicking it at you with their finger, maybe a bit harder. Here's where the physics gets really fascinating and completely destroys any chance of penny lethality. Air resistance doesn't just limit the penny's speed, it also makes the coin incredibly unstable during flight. As the penny falls, it tumbles, spins, and changes orientation constantly due to air currents and its own aerodynamic properties. This tumbling motion further reduces the effective impact force because the penny isn't hitting like a focused projectile, it's more like a wobbly leaf floating down. But wait, it gets even better. The Mythbusters television show actually tested this exact scenario using a wind tunnel to simulate the terminal velocity of various coins, and then firing them at ballistic gelatin, which mimics human tissue. The coins barely made dents in the gelatin, and when they tested with actual human volunteers wearing safety gear, people reported that being hit by a terminal velocity penny felt like being poked by a finger. The penny myth probably originated from a combination of misunderstanding physics and overestimating the lethality of falling objects in general. People intuitively understand that heavier objects falling from greater heights cause more damage, so they assume that any object falling from an extreme height must be dangerous. This intuition works for things like bowling balls or hammers, but it completely breaks down for lightweight objects with high surface area to mass ratios. The myth was probably reinforced by actual incidents involving genuinely dangerous objects being dropped from buildings. When construction workers accidentally drop tools, or when people throw bottles or other heavy items from heights, these can indeed cause serious injuries or deaths. But these incidents involve objects that are much heavier and more aerodynamically efficient than pennies, allowing them to maintain dangerous speeds all the way to the ground. What's particularly interesting is that this myth has influenced actual building design and safety regulations in some cities. Architects and building managers have spent money on protective barriers and safety measures to prevent penny dropping, even though the danger they're protecting against is physically impossible. It's a perfect example of how persistent myths can have real-world consequences even when they're scientifically baseless. The truth about falling pennies reveals something important about how we assess risk and danger in our daily lives. Our intuitions about physics are often wrong, especially when it comes to the complex interactions between gravity, air resistance, and object properties. We tend to overestimate some risks while completely ignoring others, often based on dramatic stories rather than actual probability calculations. Understanding terminal velocity and air resistance can help you make better decisions about all kinds of falling object scenarios. While pennies are harmless, other lightweight objects like ice cubes, small tools, or even paper can behave in surprising ways when dropped from heights. The key factors are always mass, surface area, and aerodynamic properties, not just height and gravity.